They thought they knew me. They had no idea. My name is Olivia Harper, and the night my husband slapped me in front of his entire family was supposed to be my worst moment. It wasn't. It was the moment I'd been waiting for. Let me take you back to that Christmas dinner. The whole Wellington family gathered around the table, wealthy, powerful, untouchable. My mother-in-law looked at me with pure contempt and said the word that would change everything: useless. She called me useless because I wouldn't bow down to her, wouldn't play the submissive wife her son married me to be. When I stood up to defend myself, my husband Marcus did something I'll never forget. He stood up, walked over, and slapped me across the face. "Don't you dare talk to my mother like that. If you can't respect her, get out." So I left. No tears, no begging, just a calm walk to my car while they celebrated their victory. But here's what they didn't know: I wasn't just Marcus Wellington's wife. I was never just his wife. 30 minutes after I drove away, Marcus's phone rang. It was his boss. 2 words. That's all it took. 2 words I'd put in motion 18 months earlier, waiting for exactly this moment. Marcus started screaming. His mother went pale, and their perfect little world began crumbling faster than they could understand. You want to know what those 2 words were? You want to see how a woman they called useless brought an entire powerful family to their knees without raising her voice once? Stay with me. Because what happens next isn't just revenge, it's a masterclass in patience planning and making sure the people who underestimate you learn exactly who you really are. This is my story. And trust me, you won't see the ending coming. My name is Olivia Harper, and I'm 34 years old. For the past decade, I've worked as a financial analyst and consultant, the kind of person who reads contracts the way other people read novels, carefully, suspiciously, and always looking for what's hidden between the lines. I learned that skill from my father, who taught me that the most important details are the ones people hope you'll overlook. The day I married Marcus Wellington, I wore a cream-colored dress that cost less than the pen I used to sign our prenuptial agreement. It was a deliberate choice. Everything that day was deliberate. The ceremony took place in a small chapel on the Wellington estate, attended by exactly 43 people. I'd counted them as they arrived, each one dressed impeccably, each one wearing the kind of polite smile that never quite reaches the eyes. These weren't guests celebrating love. They were witnesses to a transaction, and everyone in that room understood the difference. Marcus stood at the altar in a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He was handsome in that polished political way, the kind of man who looked good in photographs and knew exactly how to angle his face toward a camera. At 37, he had the bearing of someone who'd never been told no, never faced a door that didn't open when he approached. When he looked at me, I saw calculation, not affection. That was fine. I was calculating too. The officiant, a judge. Marcus's family kept on retainer, spoke words about commitment and partnership that felt hollow in the air. There were no personal vows, no promises of eternal love, no tears of joy. When it came time to exchange rings, Marcus slid a platinum band onto my finger with the same expression he might use when signing a business contract. I returned the gesture with equal detachment. What the guests didn't see was the 47-page agreement I'd signed 2 weeks earlier. My lawyer, someone I'd hired independently, someone with no connection to the Wellington family, had reviewed every clause, every subsection, every footnote. The prenuptial agreement was a masterpiece of legal precision, outlining exactly what each party would contribute to the marriage, and what each party would retain should it end. Marcus's lawyers had drafted it to protect the Wellington family assets. What they didn't realize was that I'd negotiated several clauses of my own, buried in sections they'd assumed were standard language. I signed that document with the same calm precision I brought to everything in my life. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Because I knew exactly what I was doing, even if no one else did. The reception was held in the Wellington Mansion's grand ballroom, a space so vast and ornate, it felt more like a museum than a home. Crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light, throwing fractured rainbows across marble floors. Servers moved silently between clusters of guests offering champagne and canapés that were almost too beautiful to eat. I accepted a glass of champagne but barely touched it. I needed my mind clear. That's when I first noticed how Marcus's mother was watching me. Catherine Wellington was 62, though she'd never admit it. She'd maintained her appearance through what I assumed was a combination of excellent genes, expensive procedures, and sheer force of will. She wore pearls, always pearls, and carried herself with the kind of rigid posture that suggested she'd been taught to balance books on her head as a child. But it wasn't her appearance that caught my attention. It was the expression on her face when she looked at me. Not quite hostility, not quite suspicion. Something closer to fear. I'd done my research before agreeing to marry Marcus. That's what financial analysts do. We gather data, we look for patterns, we identify risks. What I'd found was interesting. Marcus had been married before, though the Wellington family rarely spoke about it. 12 years ago, he'd married a woman named Victoria Ashford, someone equally intelligent, equally independent. The marriage lasted 18 months. Then Victoria vanished. The official story was vague. Something about her leaving in the middle of the night, taking some valuables, never to be heard from again. The police investigated briefly, found no evidence of foul play, and eventually closed the case as a voluntary disappearance. The Wellington family never filed charges for the missing assets, which I found peculiar. People that wealthy don't usually let theft go unpunished unless they have reasons to keep things quiet. I watched Catherine watching me at the reception, and I understood. She saw in me what she'd seen in Victoria, a woman who wouldn't bow, wouldn't break, wouldn't become the subservient daughter-in-law she wanted. Her insults, which would begin in earnest within weeks of the wedding, weren't born from hatred. They were tests. She wanted to see if I would run like the first one had. What Catherine didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had no intention of running. I was counting on being underestimated. I was counting on them seeing me as just another woman Marcus had married for appearances, someone who'd eventually either submit or leave. But my reasons for being there ran deeper than any of them imagined. 2 years before I met Marcus Wellington, my father died. Richard Harper, 58 years old. Brilliant businessman, careful driver, died in a single-car accident on a clear night on a road he'd driven 1,000 times. The police called it an accident. I called it convenient. Convenient for Jonathan Pierce, my father's business partner of 20 years, who took control of Harper & Associates within a week of the funeral. Convenient that all the documentation my father had been compiling about financial irregularities disappeared. Convenient that the one attorney my father trusted died 3 months later in another accident. I tried to investigate, tried to access company records, tried to find answers. But I was just a daughter, not an employee, not a legal partner. Jonathan's lawyers blocked me at every turn, using technicalities and procedures I couldn't challenge without legal standing. That's when Jonathan made his mistake. He tried to be kind. He reached out, offered to help me move forward, suggested I needed stability in my personal life before pursuing stressful business matters. And then, with what I'm sure he thought was genuine helpfulness, he introduced me to Marcus Wellington, a lawyer with political connections, a man whose family had networks that reached into every corner of business and law, a man whose wife would have access to legal privileges that a daughter didn't have. Jonathan thought he was helping me settle down, get distracted, move on from my father's death. What he actually did was hand me the key I needed. Spousal privilege meant access to certain legal consultations. Marriage to someone with Marcus's connections meant invitations to events where people talked freely, where information flowed like the expensive wine they served. 24 months of marriage would take me right up to the statute of limitations for filing certain types of legal action. I needed those 24 months. I needed the cover of being a busy newlywed too occupied with my new life to dig into old business. I needed Jonathan to think he'd neutralized me. So when Marcus proposed a calculated proposal in an expensive restaurant, more business pitch than romantic gesture, I said yes. The wedding guests raised their champagne glasses in toasts that praised our future together. Catherine watched me with those fearful eyes. Marcus smiled his political smile, and I stood there in my cream-colored dress wearing a platinum ring that meant nothing to me, thinking about file folders and deleted emails and the truth about how my father really died. She didn't marry for love, she married for access to the truth. 6 months before the wedding, I hired an assistant. Or rather, I thought I did. Elena Ross arrived in my life through a prestigious headhunting firm I'd used before, the kind of agency that charges 5-figure fees to place executive staff. Her resume was flawless, top university, 5 years of experience with high-level executives references that read like testimonials from saints. When she came for the interview, she wore a navy suit that was professional without being stuffy. Her handshake was firm, and she answered every question with exactly the right balance of confidence and deference. I hired her on the spot. Within 2 weeks, I couldn't imagine functioning without her. Elena had this uncanny ability to anticipate what I needed before I knew I needed it. If I had a meeting across town at 2, my car would be waiting at 1:45 with traffic routes already mapped to avoid construction. If I mentioned being hungry during a call, lunch would appear at my desk within 20 minutes, always something I actually wanted to eat. She managed my calendar with the precision of an air traffic controller, somehow fitting impossible schedules into 24-hour days without making me feel rushed. My coffee appeared on my desk every morning at exactly 7:45, prepared the way I liked it, 2 creams, no sugar, in the blue mug I preferred. My dry cleaning was picked up and returned without me having to think about it. Documents I needed were always printed, collated, and waiting in neat folders color-coded by priority. When I traveled, my suitcase was packed with appropriate outfits for every meeting, every dinner, every possible weather condition. It was too perfect. I knew that even then. But I'm a practical woman, and I've always trusted competence over intuition. Elena was competent beyond measure, and in my world that was worth more than gut feelings. She seemed to read my mind. I'd open my mouth to ask for something, and she'd already be handing it to me. I'd think about calling someone and find their number already pulled up on my phone. It was like having a second brain, one that ran parallel to my own processing and organizing and preparing while I focused on the actual work. Looking back now, I can see what I missed. The way Elena's eyes would linger on certain documents a fraction too long. The slight delay before she'd hand over financial statements, as if she were memorizing them first. The questions that seemed helpful, but were actually quite specific about account numbers, investment strategies, asset locations. I noticed these things peripherally, filed them away in the back of my mind, but I didn't connect the dots. I was too busy using her efficiency to further my own agenda. What I didn't know, what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that Elena Ross hadn't found me through that headhunting firm. Marcus had found her, vetted her, and paid the agency a substantial fee to make her placement look legitimate. Her mission was clear from the start. Monitor my finances, understand my asset structure, identify legal vulnerabilities that could be exploited when the time came. Marcus needed to know what I had, where I kept it, and how to access it. He needed someone on the inside, someone I'd trust. Someone who could gather intelligence while appearing to simply do her job. Elena was that someone. But Marcus made a mistake in his selection. He chose based on competence and discretion, which Elena had in abundance. What he didn't account for was that Elena had her own agenda. She'd been attracted to him from their first meeting, drawn to his polished confidence and power in the way some people are drawn to flame. When Marcus offered her the job, she saw it as more than employment. She saw it as an opportunity. If she performed well, if she proved her value, surely Marcus would see her as more than just a tool. Surely he'd recognize that she was intelligent, capable, worthy of more than a professional arrangement. Marcus paid her well, very well. $50,000 deposited into an offshore account every 6 months on top of her regular salary that I paid. He gave her clear instructions, specific information to gather regular check-ins through encrypted messages. But he never once suggested anything beyond business, never a lingering glance, never an inappropriate comment, never a hint that he saw her as anything other than a useful asset with a specific function. Elena convinced herself this was caution. Marcus was being careful, she thought, keeping distance until after the divorce. She told herself that his coldness was strategic, that once Olivia was out of the picture and the assets were secured, things would change. She'd proven herself loyal, hadn't she? Proven herself valuable? Surely that meant something. I began to notice changes in Elena around month 12 of my marriage. Small things at first. The way she'd watch me and Marcus when we appeared together at events, something sharp and assessing in her expression. The slight edge in her voice when she'd relay messages from him. The questions that became a bit more pointed, a bit more frequent about our relationship, our plans, our future. She started making small moves without authorization, mentioning to Marcus that I'd been distracted lately when I hadn't been, suggesting I might be hiding something when I was simply being private, dropping hints about accounts I'd supposedly mentioned that didn't exist, testing to see if Marcus would investigate. What Elena didn't understand was timing. Marcus was playing a long game, waiting for month 24, when certain legal clauses would maximize his advantage. But Elena was impatient. She thought she was helping, speeding things along, proving her continued value. What she was actually doing was creating variables in a carefully controlled equation, introducing unpredictability into Marcus's precise calculations. She was becoming a liability, though neither she nor Marcus realized it yet. And liabilities, in my experience, eventually expose themselves. Loyalty bought with lies has an expiration date. I've spent my entire career analyzing people through their financial decisions. Money doesn't lie the way words do. Show me someone's bank statements, their investment portfolio, their transaction history, and I'll tell you who they really are. So naturally, I analyzed my husband. Marcus Wellington presented himself as a successful attorney with a bright political future. The image was carefully constructed, the right suits, the right clubs, the right friends. But images are just surfaces, and I've always been more interested in what lies beneath. His wealth wasn't earned. It was inherited, passed down through 3 generations of Wellingtons who'd built their fortune through shipping and manufacturing in the early 20th century. That part was legitimate, documented, traceable. But there was another component to Marcus's assets, a significant portion that appeared around 2008 tied to real estate acquisitions during the financial crisis. I found the records by accident while researching something else entirely. Properties purchased for fractions of their value from desperate sellers flipped within months to overseas buyers. Profits moved through a series of LLCs that dissolved shortly after transactions completed. Nothing technically illegal, but ethically questionable. The kind of thing that would look very bad in a political campaign, the kind of thing opponents would weaponize in attack ads. Marcus needed legitimacy. He needed to transform himself from a man who'd profited from others' misery into a respectable candidate for public office. And for that, he needed the right kind of wife, not a trophy wife. Those were too obvious, too easy to dismiss as arm candy. He needed someone with substance, someone intelligent, educated, professionally accomplished, someone whose reputation would reflect well on him, whose credentials would add weight to his image. Someone like me. I have an MBA from a top program. I've built a successful consulting practice. I sit on 2 nonprofit boards. My background check is spotless. More importantly, I come from the kind of middle-class professional family that plays well with voters. Not so wealthy that I seem out of touch. Not so poor that I seem like I married up. Just right. Marcus chose me because I'm intelligent, not despite it. He calculated that a smart wife wouldn't ask stupid questions because smart people understand transactional relationships. A smart wife would see the mutual benefit. I'd get access to his network and connections. He'd get the legitimacy my reputation provided. Clean, simple, logical. What he didn't calculate correctly was exactly how intelligent I am or what I planned to do with the access he was giving me. Marcus knew I didn't love him. We'd never pretended otherwise. Our courtship had been brief and businesslike, more negotiation than romance. We'd discussed expectations over expensive dinners, outlined terms like colleagues drafting a contract. He'd been refreshingly honest about what he wanted: a stable marriage that looked good in photographs, A wife who could handle political events and donor dinners, someone who wouldn't embarrass him or make demands for emotional intimacy he had no interest in providing. I'd appreciated the honesty. It made my own deception easier. What I discovered later through documents Elena inadvertently left accessible was the full scope of Marcus's plan. 2 years of marriage would establish us as a legitimate couple under state law. During that time, we'd have joint accounts, shared investments, commingled assets. Then an amicable divorce. No drama, no scandal, just two people who'd tried and decided marriage wasn't for them. Marcus would claim his portion of our shared assets in the settlement money that would now be legitimized through legal marriage and divorce proceedings. Clean money, documented money with an unquestionable paper trail. The timeline was precise: 24 months. Not 23, not 25. Exactly 24 when certain legal provisions would maximize his advantage. He even had his next move planned. Vanessa Caldwell, 26 years old. Daughter of Senator Richard Caldwell, someone whose family connections would open political doors I never could. I found her name in an email Marcus thought he'd deleted discussing engagement timing and strategic announcement plans. I should have been angry. Instead, I was almost impressed. It was a solid plan, carefully thought through, every contingency considered. Almost every contingency. The variable Marcus hadn't fully accounted for was his mother. Catherine Wellington didn't reject me because of social class or education or any of the usual reasons mothers-in-law disapprove. She rejected me because she was terrified. Terrified that I would do to Marcus what Victoria had done 12 years ago. Terrified that another intelligent, independent woman would see through the Wellington facade and take something precious when she left. Catherine's fear manifested as pressure. She pushed Marcus constantly to control me, to establish dominance, to make sure I knew my place. She criticized everything I did, every choice I made, testing to see if I'd break or flee. She wanted Marcus to be firm, to be harsh if necessary, to show me that Wellington men didn't tolerate disobedience. This pressure destabilized Marcus's careful 24-month timeline. He'd planned for a cordial, distant marriage where we'd both maintain our respective spaces and interests. What Catherine demanded was something else entirely: visible subjugation. The appearance of a wife who knew her position and accepted it. Around month 14, I noticed Marcus changing. He became shorter with me in public, more dismissive of my opinions, more likely to contradict me in front of others. Small power plays testing boundaries. At month 16, he started making financial decisions that affected both of us without consulting me first. Minor things at first, switching our joint account to a different bank, changing our tax accountant, but each one an assertion of control. Elena noticed these changes too. She started feeding him suggestions, little comments about how I seemed too independent or didn't show enough respect. She'd mentioned seeing me meet with my own lawyer, implying secrecy and deception where there was only normal business. She was trying to speed things along, push Marcus to act more aggressively, prove her value to him. Marcus started listening to her. That was his mistake. He began to believe his own strategy was working, that I was easy to manage, that the plan was proceeding smoothly. He thought the small acts of control were establishing his dominance. He interpreted my calm acceptance as submission rather than what it actually was: observation. I watched him very carefully during those months. I documented every small cruelty, every dismissive comment, every decision made without my input. I kept records the way I'd been trained to keep records, precisely, thoroughly, with timestamps and context. Marcus thought he was playing a long game. He had no idea how long mine actually was. He thought he was using her, not realizing she was counting on exactly that. Month 18 arrived with the kind of cold that makes you question why anyone chooses to live in the Northeast. The invitation to Christmas dinner at the Wellington estate came 3 weeks in advance, formal and non-negotiable. Catherine had handwritten my name on the envelope herself, which I recognized as significant. She never did anything without purpose. When I checked my calendar to confirm availability, I discovered that Elena had already accepted on my behalf and rearranged 2 other commitments to accommodate it. She'd done this without asking me first, which was unusual. Elena always asked. The deviation from pattern made me pay attention. The dinner was scheduled for 7 in the evening on December 23rd. Catherine had invited the entire Wellington family, including relatives I'd never met. Cousins from Connecticut, an uncle from Philadelphia, Marcus's sister who lived in Boston and rarely visited. Even Marcus's grandfather, 92 years old and usually too frail to travel, was making the journey. This wasn't a simple holiday dinner. This was a gathering, a presentation, a stage set for something I couldn't quite identify yet. I arrived exactly on time, wearing a dark green dress that was elegant without being showy. Marcus met me at the door with a kiss on the cheek that was pure performance, his hand tight on my elbow as he guided me inside. The house was decorated with the kind of Christmas excess that only old money can pull off without looking gaudy. Fresh garland wound up the staircase, a 12-foot tree dominated the foyer, and every surface held arrangements of white roses and holly. The dining room table seated 24. I counted the place settings as we entered. Every seat would be filled. Catherine had positioned me in the middle of one side, surrounded by people I didn't know, isolated from Marcus, who sat at the head in his father's old chair. Catherine took the opposite end, commanding her domain like a general surveying a battlefield. The atmosphere felt wrong from the beginning. Conversations were too loud, laughter too forced. People kept glancing at me when they thought I wasn't looking. Marcus sat silent, his face carefully neutral, letting his mother orchestrate everything. He didn't participate in discussions, didn't offer opinions, just watched with those calculating eyes I'd grown familiar with. Catherine was sharper than usual. Her comments had always carried an edge, but tonight they drew blood. When I mentioned a recent project I'd completed, she interrupted to say how nice it must be to have hobbies to keep me occupied. When someone asked about our holiday plans, she answered for both of us, describing a schedule I'd never agreed to. Each small cut was delivered with a smile performed for the audience around us. I maintained perfect composure because that's what the situation required. I smiled politely, responded when spoken to, gave nothing away. But I was calculating, measuring, trying to understand what this performance was actually about. Dinner was served in courses, each one more elaborate than necessary. Somewhere between the second and third course, I realized what I was witnessing. This was a test, yes, but more than that. It was a demonstration. Catherine was showing the family that I could be controlled, diminished, put in my place. She was erasing the threat I represented by making me small in front of everyone who mattered. The insult came during dessert. Catherine had been telling a story about Marcus's childhood, something designed to make him look ambitious and driven. She turned to me, her voice carrying across the table. Of course Olivia wouldn't understand that kind of determination. She's always been rather useless when it comes to real achievement. Useless. The word hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't the first time she'd used that word to describe me, but it was the first time she'd said it in front of 23 witnesses in a room full of people whose opinions supposedly mattered. In a commercial marriage, there are rules, unspoken perhaps, but rules nonetheless. Public humiliation violates those rules. It's a breach of contract. I stood up. Not dramatically, not emotionally. I simply stood, placed my napkin beside my plate, and prepared to leave. This had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Catherine's eyes gleamed. She'd been waiting for this, I realized. Waiting for me to react, to give her what she wanted. Sit down, Olivia. We're not finished. I am, I said quietly. That's when she went further. A woman who can't even give us a grandchild has no place in this family. The words landed like stones. Around the table, people stopped pretending to eat. Forks were set down. Conversations died. Even the servers near the wall went still. I saw Marcus's jaw tighten, saw something flicker across his face, something that might have been panic. This wasn't part of his plan. He needed me to stay, needed 6 more months to reach that crucial 24-month mark. His mother was sabotaging his timeline, and he was trapped between her expectations and his own carefully calculated scheme. Marcus stood, I thought perhaps he was going to intervene to smooth things over. Instead, he walked around the table toward me. His face had gone cold, empty of everything except determination. The slap came fast, his palm connecting with my cheek with a sound that cracked through the dining room like a gunshot. For 3 seconds, the world stopped. No one breathed. No one moved. I could feel the sting spreading across my face, could taste blood where my teeth had cut the inside of my mouth. But I didn't raise my hand to my cheek, didn't cry out, didn't react at all except to meet Marcus's eyes with perfect calm. Catherine looked satisfied, vindicated. This was what she'd wanted, this proof that Wellington men controlled their wives, that I could be put down just like the last one. Elena stood in the corner where she'd been coordinating with the servers. Her face had gone white. She'd expected threats, perhaps raised voices. Not this, never this. And Marcus himself looked stunned, as if his own hand had betrayed him, as if he'd just done something he couldn't take back and didn't know how to process. "Get out," he said. His voice was cold, final. "If you can't respect my mother, you don't belong here." I looked at him for one more moment, memorizing this, documenting it the way I documented everything. Then I turned and walked toward the door. No tears, no arguments, no dramatic exits. Just calm, measured steps across marble floors, past Christmas decorations that cost more than most people earned in a year past, relatives who'd witnessed my humiliation and would never forget it. I walked out of that house and into the December cold, and something inside me that had been wound tight for 18 months finally released. That slap didn't break her plan, it activated it, 6 months early. I drove back to the Wellington house alone. Marcus stayed at his mother's estate, probably accepting congratulations for finally putting his wife in her place, or perhaps dealing with the aftermath of doing something his careful plan never included. I didn't care which. I had 40 minutes of work to do, and I'd learned long ago that emotion slows efficiency. The house was dark when I arrived. Our housekeeper had Christmas week off, which meant I had complete privacy. I went upstairs to the bedroom I'd occupied for 18 months, turned on every light, and began the systematic process of extracting myself from this place. I moved like an auditor, conducting an inventory, checking each room methodically, sorting what belonged to me from what didn't. The diamond earrings Marcus gave me for our 6-month anniversary stayed in their velvet box on the dresser. The designer handbag he'd presented at some charity gala stayed in the closet. The watch, the necklace, the bracelet, all gifts chosen by Elena, purchased with Marcus's money, given with no thought or meaning, all stayed behind. I took my laptop, the one I'd bought myself 3 years before I met Marcus. I took one suitcase of clothes, selecting items carefully. Practical pieces, things I'd purchased independently, nothing that carried the Wellington name or money. I took my running shoes, my phone charger, a framed photograph of my father that sat on the nightstand. And I took a small USB drive from the false bottom of my jewelry box, a drive no one knew existed, containing files I'd been collecting for 18 months. Financial records, email screenshots, meeting notes, conversations recorded on my phone when I suspected something important was being discussed. The kind of documentation that turns suspicions into evidence. The bathroom took 3 minutes. Toothbrush, basic toiletries, prescription medications. I left behind the expensive perfumes, the luxury skincare products, anything that Marcus had paid for. In the closet, I retrieved a lockbox from behind my winter coats, a box Marcus had never asked about, because men like him don't imagine their wives have secrets. Inside was $3,000 in cash, my passport copies of important documents, and the spare key to a place Marcus didn't know existed. 40 minutes after I arrived, I was finished. The bedroom looked barely disturbed, as if I'd simply taken a few personal items and left everything of real value behind. That's exactly what I wanted them to think. I did one final walk through the house, checking rooms I'd occupied, spaces I'd used. Home office clear. Kitchen, nothing of mine remained. Living room books I'd brought with me now packed. I wasn't sentimental about the space. It had never been my home, just a location I'd inhabited while accomplishing other objectives. What the Wellingtons didn't know, what Marcus had never discovered despite Elena's monitoring, was that I'd prepared for exactly this scenario. Not this specific scenario, perhaps I hadn't predicted the slap, but the general shape of it. The sudden exit, the need to extract myself quickly, the importance of having everything in place before the moment arrived. 6 months into our marriage, I'd rented a small apartment across town under my maiden name. Nothing fancy, just a 1-bedroom in a building with good security and parking. I'd furnished it minimally, stocked it with essentials, made it a functional safe house. The rent came from an account Marcus didn't know about, paid automatically each month, never late, never drawing attention. I had 3 separate bank accounts he'd never accessed. The first was my primary business account, the one everyone knew about, the one Elena monitored. The second was a savings account I'd opened years ago, untouched during the marriage, containing funds I'd carefully set aside before saying yes to Marcus's proposal. The third was newer, opened month 4 of our marriage, steadily accumulating transfers so small they'd never trigger scrutiny. I had a lawyer, Rebecca Stone, someone I'd retained before the wedding, someone with no connection to the Wellington family or their network. Rebecca knew everything. She'd reviewed the prenuptial agreement with a specialist's eye, had identified every clause, every contingency, every possibility. We'd built a legal strategy designed for multiple scenarios, each one mapped and prepared. The plan had always been to activate everything in month 24. That timing would maximize certain legal advantages, allow me to complete my investigation of Jonathan Pierce, position me perfectly for what came next. Month 18 was earlier than ideal, but not catastrophically so. The slap had actually given me something I didn't have before: documented grounds for immediate action, evidence of behavior that would look very bad in any legal proceeding. I'd built contingencies for contingencies. If Marcus became aggressive, I had options. If the Wellingtons tried to freeze assets, I had protections. If Elena's monitoring became too invasive, I had countermeasures. Every risk I'd identified had a response prepared, waiting to be activated. Before I left the house for the last time, I sat in my car in the darkened driveway and opened my laptop. The email to Rebecca was already drafted, saved in a folder she'd taught me to encrypt. 3 words, that's all it took. Initiate Protocol 7. I hit send at 11:47 p.m. 30 minutes later, while I was driving toward the apartment Marcus didn't know about, systems I'd set in place months ago began operating. Rebecca, who'd been waiting for this message since the day we designed the protocols, started making calls. Despite the late hour, she reached people who'd been briefed to expect contact. Lawyers who specialized in emergency filings. A private investigator who'd been on retainer for 4 months. A forensic accountant who'd been quietly reviewing documents I'd been feeding him. Documents were filed electronically, time-stamped, entered into court systems before midnight. Motions were prepared for submission first thing after the holiday break. Evidence was organized, cataloged, secured. Phone calls were placed to specific individuals who needed to know that Olivia Harper Wellington was no longer a passive wife, but an active legal adversary. The security camera footage from the Wellington dining room was being archived by a third party. The prenuptial agreement was being reviewed for breaches. Financial records were being cross-referenced and analyzed. Everything Marcus thought was private. Everything Elena thought she'd successfully hidden. Everything Catherine thought she'd gotten away with. All of it was now subject to scrutiny by professionals who knew exactly what to look for. Marcus was probably still at his mother's house accepting congratulations, believing he'd asserted dominance, thinking the difficult wife problem was solved. Catherine was probably satisfied, convinced she'd protected her son from another Victoria. Elena was probably confused, uncertain whether this outcome served her purposes. None of them understood what they'd actually done. They thought they'd broken me. They thought they'd won. They thought she left with nothing. She left with everything that mattered. I slept well that night. Better than I had in months, actually. The apartment was quiet, comfortable, and most importantly, mine. No one knew I was there. No one could reach me unless I wanted to be reached. I'd turned off my personal phone, the one Marcus had the number for, and used only my secured business line that exactly 3 people could contact. The next morning, I was drinking coffee and reviewing documents on my laptop when my business phone rang. Rebecca Stone calling at 7:30 on Christmas Eve morning. "It started," she said simply. "Tell me." "Robert Aldridge called Marcus approximately 20 minutes ago. I have a contact on the Wellington board who confirmed the call took place and described Marcus's reaction as highly distressed." I pulled up the file I'd been working on, the one that outlined every contingency, every move, every countermove. "He told Marcus about the prenuptial clause." "He did, and about the security footage. Marcus apparently didn't know the dining room had cameras." I almost smiled. Catherine Wellington had installed security cameras throughout the estate 15 years ago after a burglary that had never been solved. She'd been paranoid about protecting family assets, about documenting everything that happened in her domain. She'd never imagined those cameras would capture her son committing an act that would cost him everything she was trying to protect. "The board received their copy of the prenuptial agreement 5 months ago, correct?" I asked, though I knew the answer. I'd sent it myself through Rebecca's office, properly filed, completely above board. "Correct. Along with a notarized letter explaining that you were ensuring transparency in your financial arrangements given your husband's political aspirations. It looked like you were being helpful protecting him from accusations of hiding assets." Which is exactly how I'd designed it to look. The board had filed the document away, probably never reading it carefully, certainly never noticing the specific clause buried in Section 7, subsection C. The clause that stated if the marriage ended before month 24 due to violent behavior by either party, verified by third-party evidence, the aggressor would lose access to family trust funds for a period of 36 months. I'd negotiated that clause personally. Marcus's lawyers had accepted it because they'd never imagined their client would be the aggressor. They'd probably thought it protected Marcus from a violent wife. The wording was carefully neutral, gender-agnostic, perfectly legal. "What did Robert tell Marcus?" I asked. Rebecca's voice carried a hint of satisfaction. "That the board takes domestic violence very seriously. That they can't have a board member, much less a potential political candidate, associated with such behavior. That Marcus should expect a formal review of his position, and that he should retain legal counsel immediately." Robert Aldridge was 73 years old, a man who'd sat on the Wellington board for 40 years. He'd known Marcus since birth, had watched him grow up, had probably thought of him almost as a son. But Robert was also a man who understood liability, who knew that in the modern world, footage of a man slapping his wife at a family dinner would destroy not just the man, but everyone associated with him. The board would protect itself. They always did. "Marcus called the family lawyer," Rebecca continued. "Thomas Brennan. They spoke for 18 minutes. I don't have the content of that conversation, but my source says Brennan went into his office immediately afterward, despite it being Christmas Eve." I made a note on my laptop. Thomas Brennan had been the Wellington family attorney for 30 years. He was good, experienced, expensive. He was also predictable. I'd studied his pattern in other cases, knew how he operated, understood his strategies. "Brennan will tell Marcus to negotiate," I said. "He'll advise settling quietly before this becomes public." "That's my assessment as well. Marcus will try to contact me." "Do you want me to handle those calls?" "No. Let them go to voicemail. I want him to feel the silence." We talked for a few more minutes, finalizing details, confirming next steps. When I hung up, I sat back and thought about what was happening across town. Marcus probably still at his mother's estate, receiving calls that were destroying the careful plans he'd spent 2 years building. Catherine realizing that her test had backfired spectacularly. The entire Wellington family waking up to Christmas Eve with a crisis none of them had anticipated. My phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize, but the message told me everything I needed to know. "He's trying to call you. 5 attempts in the last 10 minutes. He looks panicked." Elena, still monitoring, still reporting, still thinking she was helping Marcus when she was actually helping me. I'd suspected for months that Elena was feeding information to Marcus. What she didn't know was that I'd given her access to specific monitoring systems deliberately. Systems that logged every access, every search, every piece of data she viewed. Systems that created a perfect record of her activities, her searches, her communications. I'd installed tracking software on my own devices, made it easy for her to access certain files, left digital breadcrumbs that looked accidental, but were completely intentional. Every email she'd read, every document she'd photographed with her phone, every conversation she'd reported back to Marcus, all of it was logged, time-stamped, preserved. Elena thought she was clever. She thought she was serving Marcus's interests while positioning herself as his ally, maybe more. She didn't understand that she was building a case file against herself, documenting her own betrayal, creating evidence that would destroy her credibility in any legal proceeding. I watched my phone counting. 3 more calls from Marcus's number in the next hour. Each one went to voicemail. I didn't listen to the messages. I didn't need to. I could imagine what they said. Demands at first, probably then attempts at reconciliation, finally perhaps pleading. The progression of a man who was beginning to understand he'd miscalculated. By noon, Elena sent another text. He's with the family lawyer now. His mother is there too. They've been in the study for over an hour. I could picture it. Thomas Brennan explaining the legal realities, the video footage, the prenuptial clause, the potential consequences. Catherine insisting this was all a misunderstanding, that surely the board would see reason. Marcus sitting there, probably silent, doing the math he should have done before he raised his hand. The political career he'd been building was over. No one runs for office with domestic violence footage in their background. The trust fund access he'd counted on was frozen. The timeline he'd so carefully calculated was destroyed. And his wife, the woman he'd thought he could control and use and discard when convenient, had disappeared into silence. That silence was its own message. It said, you no longer have access to me. You no longer get to control the narrative. You no longer get to decide how this unfolds. My phone buzzed again. Rebecca. Brennan just filed a motion requesting mediation. He wants to meet next week. Deny it, I said. We're not mediating. We're proceeding exactly as planned. He'll argue that's unreasonable. Let him argue. Every day that passes, Marcus loses more ground. He needs this resolved quickly. I don't. Because time was on my side now. Every day the board questioned Marcus's judgment. Every day his political contacts grew nervous. Every day Elena documented herself deeper into legal trouble without realizing it. The first domino had fallen, and Marcus still didn't know who pushed it. 2 days after Christmas, Elena reached out to Marcus. I knew this because she told me herself in an email that arrived at my business address with a subject line that read, "Checking in on you." The email was carefully crafted, walking a fine line between professional concern and personal worry. She wrote that she'd heard about the difficult situation and wanted to make sure I was okay. She offered to help in any way she could, said she understood how stressful this must be, suggested that perhaps talking things through would help. I read it twice, analyzing the language, the timing, the subtext. Elena was positioning herself as a bridge, a neutral party, who could facilitate communication between estranged spouses. But the email had arrived exactly 47 minutes after Marcus met with Thomas Brennan for the second time that week. The timing wasn't coincidental. What I learned later through sources I'd cultivated carefully was that Elena had gone to Marcus the morning after the phone call from Robert Aldridge. She'd found him in his home office, surrounded by legal documents, looking shaken in a way she'd never seen before. This was the opening she'd been waiting for. She didn't approach him as a woman with romantic intentions. Elena was smarter than that. She came as someone who understood the situation, who had insight into Olivia's thinking, who could help navigate the crisis. She made herself useful, made coffee, organized papers, listened while Marcus vented his frustration. Then she offered advice that seemed perfectly reasonable. Olivia is emotional right now. She's reacting from hurt, not thinking clearly. If you negotiate quickly while she's still processing everything, she'll be more likely to compromise. Women in her position usually just want it over with. Marcus believed this because it fit the narrative he needed. The narrative where Olivia was weak, emotional, acting from pain rather than strategy. The narrative where he still had some control over the situation. Elena pushed a little further, subtle and careful. I could reach out to her if you think it would help. We worked together for 18 months. She might be more willing to talk to me than to lawyers. Sometimes these things just need a human touch. Marcus agreed. Of course he did. It seemed like a reasonable approach, a way to bypass the formal legal channels that were costing him money and time. He probably thought it was his idea. What neither of them knew was that I'd been expecting exactly this move. I'd been monitoring my old work email system, the one I'd used during the marriage, the one Elena still had administrative access to as my former assistant. The monitoring software I'd installed months ago was sophisticated, invisible, and very thorough. It logged every access, every login, every file that was opened or downloaded. The patterns had started becoming obvious around month 14. Documents accessed at 3 in the morning. My calendar reviewed from IP addresses that didn't match Elena's home or the office. Financial files opened on weekends when Elena was supposedly out of town. Small anomalies that individually meant nothing but together painted a clear picture. I didn't react immediately. I've learned that manipulators make their biggest mistakes when they think they're safe, when they believe they're operating undetected. So I let Elena continue her monitoring, let her think she had access to my private information. What she was actually accessing was carefully curated, a mix of real and false data designed to look authentic while revealing nothing truly important. When her email arrived offering to help, I saw the opportunity to run a definitive test. I responded the next day, keeping my tone professional but slightly vulnerable. I thanked her for reaching out, said I appreciated her concern, admitted that yes, things were difficult and stressful. Then I mentioned casually, almost as an afterthought, that I was grateful I'd had the foresight to open that Cayman investment account back in month 8. Just a brief reference, nothing elaborate. The kind of detail someone might mention when they're feeling overwhelmed and their guard is down. The account didn't exist. I'd never opened any offshore accounts, had never moved money to the Caymans, had no intention of doing so. It was bait, carefully designed, completely fabricated. Elena's response came within an hour, sympathetic and warm. She was so glad I was managing okay, she wrote. She was here if I needed anything at all. The email said all the right things, struck all the right notes. It was perfect. I waited. 3 hours and 17 minutes later, Thomas Brennan Marcus's attorney filed a formal discovery request. Among the long list of financial documents he wanted access to was a specific item: all records related to investment accounts held in the Cayman Islands opened during the period of August through September of the previous year. August through September. Month 8 of my marriage. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. The specificity was too exact to be a general fishing expedition. Brennan didn't know about any Cayman account because there wasn't one to know about. He knew because Elena had told Marcus and Marcus had told his lawyer, and now they were all chasing a ghost I'd deliberately created. I sat at my laptop in my quiet apartment and felt something settle into place. Confirmation. Not suspicion anymore, not educated guessing. Certain knowledge that Elena Ross had been feeding my private information to my husband for months, probably since the day she was hired. I made detailed notes, timestamps, screenshots. Every piece of evidence was documented, organized, saved in multiple encrypted locations. I didn't know exactly how I'd use this information yet, but I knew it would be valuable. Betrayal always is, especially when the person doing the betraying doesn't know they've been caught. Rebecca called that evening. Did you see Brennan's discovery request? I did. He's asking for records that don't exist. I know. There was a pause. Rebecca was smart enough to understand immediately. You fed them false information. Through Elena. She took it to Marcus within hours. Now we have confirmation she's actively working against me. This could be useful in multiple ways, Rebecca said, her voice taking on the tone she used when she was already planning 3 moves ahead. I thought so too. We talked through the implications, the potential applications, the ways this knowledge could be leveraged. When I hung up, I opened my email and began drafting another message to Elena. This one would mention a meeting with a financial advisor, a conversation about asset protection, a few other small details that were just interesting enough to seem important. All of it false. All of it traceable. All of it designed to let Elena dig herself deeper while thinking she was helping Marcus. Every piece of information she gave was a test, and Elena was failing without knowing it. The formal petition for divorce arrived on January 7th, delivered by courier to Rebecca's office. Marcus had filed first, exactly as I'd predicted he would. Men like Marcus need to feel they're in control, need to believe they're making the decisions. Letting him file first gave him that illusion while costing me nothing. Thomas Brennan had drafted the petition himself, I could tell from the language. It was thorough, professional, and designed to establish Marcus as the reasonable party seeking an amicable dissolution. The filing cited irreconcilable differences without elaborating probably on Brennan's advice. No mention of the Christmas dinner, no reference to anything that might look bad in public records. Rebecca called me an hour after receiving it. Brennan's opening with a comprehensive asset disclosure request. He wants appraisals on everything: your business, your investment portfolio, even personal property over $500 in value. Standard delay tactic, I said. Exactly. He's going to drag this out, make it expensive and exhausting. The strategy is to wear you down until you accept whatever settlement Marcus offers just to make it stop. I'd seen Brennan use this approach in other cases. He was good at it, turning divorce proceedings into wars of attrition where the party with fewer resources eventually capitulated. Under normal circumstances, it might have worked. Marcus had the Wellington family wealth behind him, could afford to pay legal fees indefinitely. Most people would eventually run out of money, or patience, or both. File our response, I said. Full compliance with every request. We'll provide everything he asks for promptly and completely. There was a pause. You're sure we could challenge some of these requests as overly broad? No challenges. Give them exactly what they want. Rebecca was quiet for a moment, then I heard the smile in her voice. You're going to cooperate them to death. Something like that. What Marcus didn't know, what Brennan couldn't have anticipated, was that I'd been preparing for exactly this kind of discovery process for over a year. Every document was organized, every asset clearly documented, every piece of financial information readily available in formats that met legal requirements. There was nothing to hide because I'd never done anything that needed hiding. Within 3 days, Rebecca submitted our first response. 200 pages of financial documents perfectly organized properly, notarized with a cover letter, noting that we'd provided everything requested and were happy to supply additional information if needed. Brennan filed a motion requesting appraisals from independent evaluators. Rebecca agreed, immediately suggested 3 qualified firms, and had my business records ready for review within a week. The Wellington lawyer requested my tax returns for the past 7 years. Rebecca provided them the same day, along with supporting documentation that explained every deduction and every source of income. Each time Brennan made a request expecting resistance or delay, he received immediate, complete compliance. Each time Marcus probably anticipated a fight, he encountered only professional cooperation. I watched this unfold from my apartment, receiving regular updates from Rebecca, tracking the progression of legal maneuvers. I could imagine Marcus's confusion growing with each perfectly prepared response. This wasn't how divorces were supposed to go. There should be arguments over what needed to be disclosed, fights about privacy, resistance to invasive requests. Instead, I was giving them everything they asked for and more. Catherine supported the aggressive approach, of course. From what my sources told me, she was fully involved in strategy sessions, pushing Brennan to be more demanding, more thorough. She saw this as an opportunity to finally rid the family of a woman she'd never accepted, to prove that Wellington men didn't lose to their wives. What Catherine didn't understand was that compliance isn't the same as weakness. Cooperation isn't surrender. Sometimes the most powerful move is to give people exactly what they ask for and let them discover it's not what they needed. Marcus began to feel uneasy, I could tell from the questions Brennan started asking. Why wasn't Olivia fighting? Where was the resistance? What was she planning? That's when Elena made her contribution, feeding Marcus information that confirmed what he wanted to believe. She reported that I looked tired during our occasional email exchanges, said I seemed stressed, mentioned I was having trouble sleeping, told Marcus that in her professional opinion I was approaching my breaking point and would probably accept a reasonable settlement soon just to end the ordeal. None of it was true. I was sleeping fine, felt less stressed than I had in months, and had no intention of settling for anything less than exactly what I'd planned. But Elena's reports gave Marcus the narrative he needed. They explained my cooperation as weakness rather than strategy, my efficiency as desperation rather than preparation. Marcus started making mistakes. Brennan would advise caution, suggest reviewing certain clauses more carefully, recommend taking time to consider implications. Marcus would override him, push to move faster, insist that Olivia was ready to cave and they should press the advantage. The counter-proposal Rebecca submitted in late January was 63 pages long, dense with legal terminology, structured in sections that referenced multiple statutes and precedents. It was designed to look complex and technical, the kind of document that required careful reading and analysis. Brennan probably advised Marcus to review it thoroughly, to let him explain each section, to take time understanding the implications. I imagine Marcus dismissed those concerns. He was confident now, buoyed by Elena's false reports, certain that this was just legal posturing before inevitable surrender. He signed preliminary agreements to procedural points without reading them carefully. He accepted timelines that seemed favorable on the surface without considering what they actually meant. He agreed to discovery protocols that appeared standard but contained specific language that would matter later. All because Elena had told him I was weak, exhausted, ready to compromise. All because he wanted to believe he was winning. I watched it happen from a distance, receiving updates from Rebecca, seeing Marcus make choices that felt like victories, but were actually concessions. Each signature, each agreement, each overlooked detail was another piece of the structure I was building. Catherine probably thought they were dismantling me systematically. Elena probably thought she was helping Marcus secure his victory. Brennan probably felt professional satisfaction at executing a thorough legal strategy. And Marcus probably felt like he was finally in control, finally asserting dominance, finally showing everyone that Wellington men didn't lose to their wives. Confidence is dangerous when it's built on lies someone else told you. Jonathan Pierce walked into Rebecca Stone's office on a Tuesday afternoon in early February, unannounced but not unexpected. Rebecca's assistant called me immediately, and I told her to let him wait 15 minutes before showing him in. Small power plays matter with men like Jonathan. They notice when they're not immediately accommodated. When Rebecca called me after the meeting, her voice was carefully neutral. He presented himself as concerned about your welfare, said he'd known your father for 20 years and felt responsible for making sure you were protected during this difficult time. What did he offer? Legal assistance, financial advice. He has connections that could help expedite the divorce proceedings. He seemed very eager to be helpful. I'd been expecting this visit since the moment Marcus filed for divorce. Jonathan Pierce was many things, but patient wasn't one of them. He'd need to know how the divorce was proceeding, whether I was winning or losing, whether I posed a threat to his carefully constructed facade. I told him you had excellent representation and didn't require additional counsel, Rebecca continued. He seemed disappointed but understanding. Left his card said to call if you changed your mind. Did he ask any specific questions? Several. About your asset structure, about the complexity of the settlement, about whether you were planning to pursue any business interests after the divorce. I kept my answers vague. I made notes as we talked, adding to the file I'd been building on Jonathan Pierce for 2 years. A file that grew thicker every month, filled with questions that didn't have answers yet, but someday would. Jonathan Pierce had been my father's business partner for 2 decades. They'd built Harper and Associates together, though my father had always been the majority shareholder, the visionary, the one with the instinct for which companies to acquire and when. Jonathan handled operations, managed the details, kept the machinery running while my father focused on strategy. When my father died, Jonathan had moved quickly. Within a week, he'd called an emergency board meeting. Within 2 weeks, he'd been appointed interim CEO. Within 3 months, he'd restructured everything, buying out smaller shareholders, consolidating power, making it nearly impossible for me to challenge his control. I'd tried. God knows I'd tried. But I was just a daughter, not an employee, not a board member. I had no legal standing to demand records, no authority to question decisions. Jonathan's lawyers had blocked me at every turn, citing corporate governance rules, shareholder agreements, confidentiality clauses. That's when Jonathan had reached out personally, invited me to lunch, told me how sorry he was about my father. He'd offered advice, suggested I needed time to grieve, recommended I focus on building my own life rather than dwelling on the past. And then, with what seemed like genuine concern, he'd said something I didn't understand until much later. "You should stabilize your personal life, Olivia. Your father would want you settled happy. Business matters can wait. There's no rush to deal with inheritance claims or company issues. Focus on yourself first." 2 weeks after that conversation, Jonathan introduced me to Marcus Wellington at a charity gala. Mentioned that Marcus was single, accomplished, from a good family, made sure we were seated together at dinner. Followed up afterward to ask if we'd enjoyed meeting each other. I'd thought he was being kind, playing matchmaker, trying to help me move forward after losing my father. Now I understood he was doing something else entirely. He was managing me, directing me into a situation that would keep me occupied and distracted. A marriage would consume my time and energy. A husband with political ambitions would require attention, would demand I play a certain role, would keep me busy with the performance of being Mrs. Wellington. I wouldn't have time to dig into my father's company, wouldn't have resources to hire investigators, wouldn't have the credibility to make accusations against a respected businessman. And if the marriage went badly, if I ended up in a messy divorce, losing credibility, looking unstable or vindictive, any claims I made about Jonathan would seem like deflection, like a woman grasping for targets to blame for her own failures. I opened my laptop and started searching through old emails, looking for the patterns I'd missed before. Jonathan's messages during my engagement and early marriage all carried the same subtext. Congratulations on finding happiness. Focus on building your new life. Don't worry about old business matters. Everything at the company is running smoothly. Your father would want you to move forward, not stay stuck in the past. Every message was designed to keep me looking forward, not backward. To make me believe that pursuing questions about my father's death or the company's transition was dwelling on grief rather than seeking answers. I found an email from 3 months into my marriage where I'd asked Jonathan about accessing some of my father's old files. His response had been polite, but firm. Those files were corporate property, he'd written. Accessing them would require board approval, legal clearances, proper protocols. It would be complicated and time-consuming. Was I sure I wanted to pursue it when I had so much else going on with my new marriage? I'd backed off. Let it go. Focused on Marcus and the wedding and building the appearance of a normal life. Exactly what Jonathan wanted. Now, 2 years later, Jonathan was appearing in my divorce proceedings. Not obviously, not directly, but there. His name showed up in CC lines on emails between lawyers. Rebecca mentioned him being referenced in conversations with Brennan. Financial inquiries that seemed to originate from sources connected to Jonathan's network. He was testing, probing, trying to determine how much control I still had, whether the divorce was weakening me the way he'd hoped. If I came out of this marriage broken and discredited, Jonathan could breathe easy. If I emerged strong with resources intact and reputation undamaged, he'd need to take different measures. I pulled up the timeline I'd been building, marking events' connections patterns. My father's death, Jonathan's rapid takeover, his introduction of Marcus, the marriage, now the divorce. Each piece fit together too neatly to be coincidental. The divorce was never just about a marriage. It was about silencing a daughter who knew too much. The notification came at 7:30 on a Thursday morning. An automated email from Mercer Financial, the institution where I held a moderate investment account I'd opened 4 years before I met Marcus. The message was brief and bureaucratic. Your account ending in 4738 has been temporarily frozen pending resolution of a legal inquiry. Please contact our compliance department for details. $50,000. Not enough to cripple me, but enough to send a clear message. Someone had the reach and knowledge to touch my finances. I called the compliance department as soon as they opened. The representative was apologetic but firm. They'd received a legal request properly filed requiring them to freeze the account while certain matters were investigated. She couldn't provide details over the phone but could email me a copy of the order. The document arrived 10 minutes later. I read it 3 times, analyzing every line. The request had been filed through proper channels, cited appropriate statutes, included all necessary legal language. On the surface, it appeared to originate from Thomas Brennan's office as part of standard divorce discovery procedures. But something was off. The signature at the bottom didn't match Brennan's usual style. I'd seen enough of his documents by now to know how he signed things, a particular flourish on the final letter, a specific way he dated forms. This signature was close but not quite right, like a skilled forgery that almost passed inspection. Someone else had filed this. Someone with enough legal knowledge to make it look legitimate, enough access to use appropriate letterhead and reference numbers, but not quite enough attention to detail to perfectly replicate Brennan's signature. I sat back and thought about what this meant. This wasn't about the $50,000. This was a test. Someone wanted to see how I'd react when my finances were threatened. Would I panic? Would I immediately file counter motions, make angry calls, demand explanations? Would I show my hand by revealing what other accounts I had, what other resources I could access? Rebecca called 20 minutes later. I saw the freeze notice. This is highly irregular. Brennan didn't mention any account seizure requests in our last communication. He didn't file it, I said. The paperwork says. I know what it says. Look at the signature. Compare it to other documents from his office. There was silence while Rebecca presumably pulled up files. Then, you're right. This is close, but it's not his actual signature. Someone's using his firm's credentials without authorization, or this came from somewhere else entirely. Jonathan Pierce, I said quietly. You think he has that kind of access? I think he has connections I haven't fully mapped yet, and I think he's testing to see how I respond to pressure. Rebecca's voice took on the edge she got when discussing legal strategy. We should file an immediate challenge. This kind of irregular seizure, if we can prove it's improperly filed, could actually work in our favor. We could demonstrate bad faith on the opposing side. No, I said. Olivia. Not yet. Let them think it worked. The silence on the other end told me Rebecca was processing this, running through implications. She was good at thinking several moves ahead, which was why I'd hired her. You want them to believe you're vulnerable. I want them to believe their strategy is effective. 50,000 is nothing compared to what's actually at stake. If they think freezing that account rattled me, they'll get confident. Confident people make mistakes. They'll push harder. Marcus will see this as confirmation that aggressive tactics work. Good, let him push. Every aggressive move is documented. Every overreach becomes evidence. I could almost hear Rebecca thinking through the chess game. What are you planning? I'm moving assets. Nothing illegal, nothing they can challenge. Just restructuring holdings into instruments that won't show up in standard discovery. Let them freeze the visible accounts. What they can't see won't help them. We talked for another 20 minutes, Rebecca mapping out the legal boundaries of what I could and couldn't do, making sure my restructuring stayed within appropriate parameters. When I hung up, I began the careful process of shifting my financial foundation. The investment account they'd frozen was what I thought of as a decoy money that was real but not critical, visible but not essential. I had other holdings they didn't know about. Accounts opened under my maiden name before the marriage. Investments structured through trusts my father had established years ago. Assets that wouldn't appear in standard searches because they predated my relationship with Marcus, or were held in structures designed for privacy rather than secrecy. I spent the next 3 days quietly moving pieces. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger alerts, just patient, methodical restructuring. Marcus apparently interpreted the frozen account as a victory. Elena reported through her carefully worded emails that I seemed distracted and concerned about finances. She told Marcus I learned later that in her professional opinion, I was beginning to understand the seriousness of my situation. None of it was true. I was sleeping well, eating normally, working productively. The frozen account bothered me only as evidence that Jonathan had more reach than I'd fully appreciated, which was useful information worth the temporary inconvenience. Marcus filed another motion, this one demanding comprehensive appraisal of all assets I'd acquired in the past 5 years. He wanted evaluators, auditors, full documentation. The request was aggressive, expensive, and designed to overwhelm. Rebecca forwarded me the filing with a note, "He's getting bolder." I smiled when I read it. Bold meant confident. Confident meant he thought he was winning. Elena sent me an email asking how I was holding up, her tone perfectly calibrated between professional concern and personal sympathy. I responded briefly, mentioned feeling tired, said the legal process was more complicated than I'd anticipated. Every word was calculated to reinforce the narrative she was building for Marcus. Within hours, she'd reported back to him. I knew this because Brennan filed an aggressive settlement proposal that afternoon, one that assumed I was ready to negotiate from a position of weakness. I reviewed the proposal with Rebecca. The terms were worse than what Marcus had initially suggested, assuming I'd lost ground, assuming I'd take less just to end the ordeal. "Reject it," I told Rebecca, "with a counter-offer." "No, just rejection. No explanation, no counter. Let them wonder why." That night, I sat in my apartment reviewing the restructured assets. Everything important was now protected, moved into positions they wouldn't find secured in ways that would take months to uncover through legal discovery. The visible accounts they could see and feel victorious about were the least important pieces of my financial structure. Marcus thought he was winning because an account got frozen. Elena thought she was helping because she was feeding him information that seemed useful. Jonathan thought his test had succeeded because I hadn't fought back loudly. What they all missed was that silence isn't the same as weakness. Strategic retreat isn't surrender. And sometimes the best move is to let your opponents think they're winning while you rebuild your position in places they can't see. Sometimes the best move is to let them think they're winning. That night, sitting in my apartment with files spread across my desk, I allowed myself to think about why I was really doing this. Not the divorce, not the careful legal maneuvering, but all of it. The entire 2-year plan that had led me to this moment. I pulled out a photograph from my desk drawer. My father, Richard Harper, taken 6 months before he died. He was standing in front of Harper & Associates headquarters, 58 years old, graying at the temples, smiling the way he did when he'd just closed a complicated deal. 2 years ago, on a clear October night, my father drove home from a confidential meeting with the company's external auditor. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m., unusual, but not unprecedented. My father left the auditor's office at 9:15. His car was found at 11:30, wrapped around a tree on a road he'd driven countless times in weather that was perfect with no other vehicles involved. The police investigation took 4 days. They concluded he'd lost control of the vehicle, possibly fell asleep at the wheel, or suffered a medical episode. Single car accident. No witnesses, no evidence of foul play. Case closed. I knew something was wrong within hours of getting the call. My father didn't fall asleep while driving. He was meticulous about rest, about safety, about everything. And the timing was too convenient. A confidential meeting about financial irregularities, then a fatal accident on the way home. I tried to access the records from that meeting. The auditing firm told me everything had been erased per standard data retention policies. I asked for my father's calendar, his notes, any documentation about what he was investigating. The company's lawyers informed me that those were proprietary corporate records, not personal effects, and I had no legal standing to review them. Jonathan Pierce called an emergency board meeting 3 days after the funeral. By the end of the week, he was interim CEO. By the end of the month, he'd restructured the board. Within 6 months, he'd bought out minority shareholders, consolidated power, and made himself permanent CEO of the company my father had built. I fought back the only way I knew how. I hired lawyers, filed requests for documents, demanded access to company records as Richard Harper's heir. Jonathan's legal team blocked me at every turn. I wasn't an employee, they said. I wasn't on the board. I had no corporate standing. My inheritance was clearly defined in my father's will: personal assets, not company control. Every request I filed was denied. Every legal approach was countered with better lawyers, better arguments, more resources than I could match. I was a 28-year-old financial analyst going up against a corporation with decades of legal infrastructure. I was losing before I started. That's when I began investigating differently, quietly, carefully. I found my father's private attorney, Daniel Morrison, a man my father had trusted for 20 years. Daniel was cautious when I first approached him, but eventually he confirmed what I suspected. My father had been investigating major financial irregularities, money moving in ways that didn't make sense, accounts that didn't match documentation. Daniel had been helping him build a case. The last email Daniel received from my father, sent the afternoon of the day he died, contained just 7 words: "Pierce is hiding something big. Keep digging." 3 months later, Daniel Morrison died. Heart attack while hiking, according to the medical examiner. He was 62, apparently healthy, no history of cardiac problems. His files were destroyed in a fire at his office 2 weeks after his death. Electrical fault, the fire inspector said. Nothing suspicious. 2 accidents, 2 deaths, 2 men who knew what Jonathan Pierce was hiding. I realized then that I couldn't investigate openly. I couldn't hire private detectives, couldn't file obvious legal requests, couldn't do anything that would signal to Jonathan that I was still pursuing this. I needed cover. I needed access to legal networks I didn't have. I needed to appear busy with other things while I quietly gathered evidence. I needed exactly 24 months. The statute of limitations for filing certain types of corporate fraud lawsuits was 2 years from the date of death. I had until October of this year to build my case file, the necessary paperwork, present evidence that would be strong enough to overcome Jonathan's lawyers. When Jonathan introduced me to Marcus Wellington 6 months after my father's death, I saw the opportunity for what it was. Not romance, not even genuine matchmaking, but Jonathan trying to manage me. Keep me distracted, keep me focused on building a new life instead of questioning the old one. What Jonathan didn't realize was that I saw the same opportunity from a different angle. Marcus Wellington was a lawyer with extensive political connections. His family had relationships with judges, prosecutors, law firms across 3 states. Marcus attended events where powerful people spoke freely. His network included people who had access to information I could never reach on my own. Marrying Marcus gave me spousal privilege for certain legal consultations. It gave me invitations to events where I could quietly cultivate sources. It gave me the appearance of being a busy newlywed while I was actually building a case against Jonathan Pierce. For 18 months, I gathered evidence. I attended Marcus's political fundraisers and talked to financial regulators. I went to charity galas and met forensic accountants. I joined Marcus at legal conferences and identified specialists in corporate fraud. Every business dinner, every cocktail party, every networking event was an opportunity to collect one more piece of information. I found the shell companies Jonathan used to move money. I traced transactions through 3 layers of corporate structures. I identified the offshore accounts where millions had disappeared. I located the former Harper & Associates employees who'd been quietly paid off to stay silent. I collected emails, transaction records, testimony from people who knew pieces of the truth but had never been asked the right questions. The Christmas slap accelerated everything by 6 months. My original plan had been to stay married until month 24, then file for divorce, and immediately file the fraud lawsuit against Jonathan with perfect timing. Now I had to work faster, gather the final pieces of evidence while managing a divorce that was happening earlier than I'd planned. But the slap also gave me something I hadn't had before: documented evidence of Marcus's character leverage in the divorce that would make him desperate to settle quickly. His desperation was useful. His need to control the narrative was useful. Everything he did to try to defeat me in divorce court was actually helping me build the case against Jonathan. Her marriage wasn't a distraction, it was the investigation. The monitoring systems I'd placed on Elena's devices months ago sent me an alert at 2:37 on a Friday afternoon. Unusual activity detected. Email access to an account she shouldn't have had credentials for. I was in a coffee shop reviewing financial documents when the notification appeared on my phone. I packed up my laptop and went home to check the full logs. Elena had accessed Marcus's private email account, the one he used for communications with his personal attorney rather than the divorce lawyer. She'd somehow obtained his password, probably through one of those frighteningly simple methods, like watching him type it or finding it written in a desk drawer. The access log showed she'd spent 11 minutes reading through messages, downloading 3 specific emails. I pulled up the mirror feed that showed what she'd viewed. The first email was dated 6 months ago, Marcus writing to his personal attorney about post-divorce planning. The second was from 3 months ago, discussing timing and strategy. The third was from last week, containing a single paragraph that must have felt like a blade to Elena's heart. After divorce, finalized, proceed with engagement announcement to Vanessa Caldwell as discussed. Senator Caldwell has agreed to the timeline. Wedding to follow 6 months after announcement. Ensure all financial arrangements are properly structured before public disclosure. Vanessa Caldwell. 26 years old, blonde, photogenic daughter of Senator Richard Caldwell, who chaired 2 important committees. I'd seen her at events with Marcus, noticed how he paid attention to her, how he positioned himself in photographs. I'd assumed she was part of his political networking. Apparently, she was much more than that. Marcus had been planning his next marriage while still married to me, probably since before the Christmas dinner. Elena, who'd spent 18 months feeding him information, monitoring me, believing she was building towards something with him, had just discovered she'd never been part of his future at all. The monitoring system tracked Elena's next movements. She'd sat at her computer for 43 minutes after discovering the emails, not typing, not moving much. Just processing. Then she'd stood up, left her apartment, and driven to Marcus's house. I didn't have audio of their confrontation, but I had the aftermath. Elena sent an email to herself immediately after leaving Marcus's house, the kind of message people send when they're too upset to talk to anyone but need to document what happened. The email was raw, unedited, probably typed on her phone in her car. He said I was paid help, that this was always a work relationship. He asked if I actually thought I had a long-term role in his life, like the idea was absurd. He didn't apologize, didn't even seem to understand why I was upset, just looked at me like I was being unprofessional, like I was the one who'd misunderstood the situation. I read the email twice, mapping the psychology, understanding how this moment would reshape Elena's decisions. A woman scorned is dangerous, but a woman who realizes she was never valued enough to be scorned is something else entirely. Elena hadn't just lost a relationship, she'd discovered she'd never had one. Every small kindness from Marcus that she'd interpreted as affection had been management techniques. Every moment she'd treasured had meant nothing to him. That kind of realization changes people, makes them unpredictable, makes them willing to burn everything down because they have nothing left to protect. I watched Elena's digital footprint over the next 72 hours. She researched Victoria Wellington, Marcus's first wife, the woman who'd disappeared 12 years ago. Elena found old news articles, social media posts from before the disappearance public records. She spent 6 hours digging through digital archives, building a profile of a woman most people assumed was dead. Then Elena did something I hadn't anticipated. She found Victoria. I don't know exactly how she managed it, what databases she accessed, or what information she leveraged. But 3 days after her confrontation with Marcus, Elena sent an encrypted message through a service designed for anonymous contact. The message was brief. I know you're alive. I know what the Wellington family did to you. I have information about Marcus that you'll want to see. Contact me if you're interested in making sure he pays for what he did to both of us. The message went to an email address registered in Vancouver under the name Rebecca Morrison. Elena had somehow tracked Victoria to Canada, found her alias, and made contact. I sat back from my computer and thought about what this meant. Elena was no longer just feeding information to Marcus. She was actively working against him now, reaching out to someone whose existence could complicate everything Marcus was trying to build. If Victoria was alive, if she could be convinced to resurface, the legal implications for Marcus were substantial. Questions about their divorce, about asset division, about whether his marriage to me had even been legal. But Elena didn't understand the full scope of what she was doing. She thought she was simply finding an ally against Marcus, someone who shared her grievance. She didn't know about Jonathan Pierce's involvement, didn't know about my investigation, didn't understand that Victoria's reappearance could affect more than just Marcus's divorce proceedings. Elena was stepping into a game with more players than she realized, making moves that would have consequences she couldn't anticipate. She thought she was taking control of her destiny, using what she knew to gain leverage or exact revenge. What she'd actually done was add a new variable to an already complex equation, one that I'd now have to account for in my planning. Hell hath no fury like a woman who realizes she was never part of the plan. By mid-March, the divorce settlement was nearly complete. Rebecca and I had been working toward this moment for weeks, crafting language structuring clauses, building a document that looked straightforward on the surface while containing mechanisms that would activate later. Thomas Brennan called Rebecca to schedule the final signing. His tone, she reported, was satisfied, almost smug. Marcus had apparently told him they'd won, that Olivia Harper had proven to be easier to manage than expected. Brennan believed they were getting a favorable settlement, 30% of shared assets to Marcus, the family trust fund remaining untouched, a clean separation with minimal complications. Rebecca sent me the final draft for review on a Tuesday evening. 147 pages of legal documentation dense with clauses and subclauses, references to statutes and precedents. Most people would skim it, trusting their lawyers to handle the details. I read every word. The Asset Protection Clause appeared on page 83, section 12, subsection F. Rebecca and I had crafted it over multiple sessions, workshopping the language until it was perfect. Technical enough to look legitimate. Vague enough to be interpreted multiple ways. Balanced enough that neither side would immediately object. The clause stated that if within 60 days of signing either party discovered that the other had concealed assets, committed fraud, or materially misrepresented their financial disclosure, they could petition the court to reverse the settlement and demand compensation. On first reading, it looked like a standard protection for both parties, a way to ensure neither side was hiding anything significant. Brennan would read it as favorable to Marcus. It gave his client 60 days to investigate whether Olivia had hidden money, concealed investments, or lied about her financial position. Given Elena's reports that I was stressed and struggling, Marcus probably believed finding such evidence would be easy. What Brennan wouldn't catch on first reading, what Marcus wouldn't understand until too late, was how the clause worked in reverse. The language was carefully constructed. If Marcus failed to prove material misrepresentation within 60 days, if he couldn't present credible evidence that I'd concealed assets or committed fraud, then the clause activated in the opposite direction. All assets Marcus had received from the Wellington Family Trust Fund, valued at approximately $4.2 million, would be transferred to a third-party trust managed by an independent trustee. Marcus wouldn't lose the money completely, but he couldn't access it until he demonstrated financial independence, defined as stable personal income of at least $200,000 annually for 24 consecutive months, earned through employment or business activities separate from family wealth. For a man who'd spent his entire life living off inherited money, who'd never built anything independently, who'd always relied on the Wellington Family Trust to fund his lifestyle, this would be devastating. 2 years of proving he could earn his own living before touching family money. 2 years during which his political ambitions would stall his social position, would weaken his power, would erode. The clause was buried in 8 pages of technical legal language about asset protection, fiduciary responsibilities, and disclosure requirements. Rebecca had structured it to look like standard boilerplate, the kind of protective language that appeared in complex financial settlements. Brennan would skim it, probably nod approvingly at the 60-day investigation period that seemed to favor his client, and never fully grasp what he was agreeing to. The signing was scheduled for March 23rd at Brennan's office. I didn't attend. Rebecca represented me, which was standard practice. Marcus and his lawyer on one side, Rebecca on the other, a court reporter documenting everything. Rebecca called me 30 minutes after it concluded. He signed. Did Brennan raise any questions about Section 12? He mentioned it favorably, said it was good that Marcus would have time to investigate your financial disclosure. Marcus seemed pleased. He was smiling when he signed. I could imagine it. Marcus confident, probably thinking he'd already won, believing the next 60 days would just be a formality while he gathered evidence of my supposed deceptions. Elena had probably assured him that finding such evidence would be simple. What neither of them understood was that there was no hidden evidence to find. Every asset I'd disclosed was real. Every account I'd listed was accurate. Every financial statement I'd provided was honest. I'd been scrupulously truthful in my disclosures because I'd known this moment was coming. Marcus would spend 60 days searching for fraud that didn't exist. He'd get increasingly desperate as days passed and he found nothing. That desperation would make him sloppy, make him willing to listen to suggestions he shouldn't consider. Elena, angry and vengeful, would probably offer to help. She'd suggest fabricating evidence if real evidence couldn't be found. She'd push Marcus toward actions that would cross legal lines that would create the very fraud she was supposed to be uncovering. And I would document everything. Every illegal search, every fabricated claim, every desperate attempt to create evidence where none existed. All of it would become part of a record that would destroy Marcus's credibility in any future legal proceeding. The 60-day period also served another purpose. It gave me exactly the time I needed to complete my investigation of Jonathan Pierce. I was close now, within weeks of having everything I needed to file criminal complaints with multiple agencies. The divorce settlement's 60-day clause would keep Marcus occupied, focused on me while I finalized the case that would bring down the man who'd killed my father. The trap wasn't in what the contract said. It was in what it would make them do. Marcus would hunt for evidence that wasn't there. Elena would suggest creating evidence. Jonathan would watch it all, probably offering assistance, making himself more visible in the divorce proceedings. And I would wait, patient and methodical, letting them exhaust themselves against defenses I'd built months ago. 60 days. The countdown had started the moment Marcus signed his name. They signed the trap, thinking it was a weapon. The call came from a private investigator I'd retained 6 months ago, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in tracking people who didn't want to be found. Her voice was neutral when she said, "I have information about Victoria Wellington. She's alive." I was in my apartment reviewing financial documents for the case against Jonathan Pierce. I set down my pen carefully. "Where?" "Vancouver. She's been living under the name Rebecca Morrison for the past 11 years. Works as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm. Keeps a low profile. No social media, no public records, nothing that would draw attention." "How did you find her?" "I didn't. Someone else found her first and made contact 3 days ago. I've been monitoring for any signs of Victoria Wellington resurfacing, and the monitoring flagged unusual activity. An encrypted message sent through an anonymous service originating from this area received in Vancouver. The recipient was Rebecca Morrison." I pulled up my laptop, already knowing what I'd find. Elena's recent activity showed searches for Victoria Wellington, deep dives into old news articles, exploration of missing persons databases. She'd found Victoria, or found enough to make an educated guess about where to look. "Elena Ross sent the message," I said. Sarah confirmed. "That's my assessment. And there's more. Jonathan Pierce has been in contact with Victoria for approximately 6 weeks. Multiple encrypted communications, at least 2 video calls. He found her before your assistant did." "Of course he did. Jonathan was always 3 steps ahead of everyone else, always building contingency plans, always preparing for variables others didn't see coming." He'd found Victoria and positioned her as a weapon to use when needed. "Is she coming back?" I asked. "Already on her way. She booked a flight yesterday. Arrives tomorrow afternoon. She's retained a lawyer here, someone named Gerald Kessler, who specializes in estate challenges." I made notes thinking through implications. Victoria Wellington officially declared dead 7 years ago after disappearing 12 years ago, returning to contest her estate settlement. If she was alive, if she could prove she'd been alive all along, she had legal grounds to challenge everything that had happened after she vanished. The divorce settlement that awarded Marcus her share of assets. The death declaration that had freed him to remarry. Potentially even his marriage to me if Victoria could argue he'd never been legally free to enter into it. Jonathan had orchestrated this carefully. Victoria's return would create legal chaos that would occupy Marcus, distract me, tie up courts and lawyers for months. While everyone was fighting over who owned what from 12 years ago, Jonathan would have time to hide evidence, move money, cover his tracks regarding my father's death and the embezzlement from Harper and Associates. I thought about Victoria, a woman I'd never met, but whose shadow had hung over my marriage from the beginning. Catherine's fear of me was rooted in what Victoria had done in how she'd disappeared and taken assets with her. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if Victoria hadn't stolen anything but had run for her life? I made a decision that would have surprised Rebecca if I'd consulted her first. "Find out where she's staying," I told Sarah. "I want to meet with her. Just the two of us. No lawyers, no mediators. Can you arrange it?" "That's highly irregular." "I know. Can you arrange it?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "I can try. What do you want me to tell her?" "Tell her that Olivia Harper wants to talk before the lawyers get involved. Tell her I'm not her enemy." 2 days later, I sat in a quiet cafe in a neighborhood neither of us had any connection to, waiting for Victoria Wellington. She arrived exactly on time, which told me something about her character. 12 years of hiding hadn't made her careless about details. She was 42, but looked older, the kind of aging that comes from stress rather than years. Her hair was shorter than in the old photographs I'd seen, darker, styled differently. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, nothing that would draw attention. Her eyes scanned the cafe before settling on me, assessing cautious. I'd chosen a table in the back, private but visible. I stood when she approached. "Thank you for coming," I said. Victoria sat down without offering to shake hands. "I wasn't sure I should. Jonathan advised against it." "I'm sure he did." I sat across from her, keeping my hands visible on the table, body language open. "Why did you agree?" "Curiosity, and because the message said you weren't my enemy. I wanted to see if that was true." We ordered coffee from a server who seemed to sense this wasn't a conversation to interrupt. When she left, I looked at Victoria directly. "Why are you really back? And what exactly did Jonathan Pierce promise you?" Victoria's expression shifted slightly, surprise, breaking through the careful neutrality. "You know about Jonathan. I know he's been in contact with you for 6 weeks. I know he found you before Elena did. I know he's positioning you as a weapon to use against Marcus and me. What I don't know is whether you understand what he's really doing." She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. "He promised to help me reclaim the inheritance Catherine stole from me. He said he could help me challenge the estate settlement, get back what was legally mine. And in exchange, I create legal chaos, tie up Marcus in court, complicate your divorce, give Jonathan time to—" He didn't specify what, but I'm not stupid. He needs time for something. I leaned forward slightly. "Let me tell you what he needs time for. He needs to cover up the fact that he murdered my father and stole his company. He needs to hide evidence of embezzlement and fraud. And he's using you the same way he used me, the same way he used Marcus. You're a tool to him, Victoria. Just like I was." The past didn't stay buried. It came back with its own agenda. The 60-day countdown began the moment Marcus signed the settlement agreement. I knew within hours that he'd hired surveillance because the man following me was obvious. A gray sedan that appeared outside my apartment building the morning after the signing, the same car 3 blocks behind me when I drove to Rebecca's office parked across the street when I stopped for groceries. Marcus had hired a private investigator named Raymond Cross, according to the background check I ran after identifying his license plate. Cross specialized in surveillance and asset discovery, had worked on dozens of divorce cases, and charged $300 an hour. Marcus was paying him to watch me constantly looking for any sign of hidden accounts, undeclared assets, or fraudulent behavior. I made Cross's job as boring as possible. My days became utterly routine. I woke at 6:30 every morning, made coffee, read the news. At 8, I'd drive to Rebecca's office or work from my apartment. I met no one except Rebecca, and always in public places with security cameras. I made no unusual transactions. My credit card purchases were mundane groceries, gas, office supplies. I withdrew no unusual amounts of cash. I made no suspicious phone calls. Elena, still playing both sides, fed Marcus leads that she thought would help. She mentioned that I'd supposedly referred to a Swiss bank account in an email. Cross investigated, found nothing. She suggested I might have investments in cryptocurrency under a different name. Cross checked, found nothing. Each lead she provided was a trap I'd set months ago, false information designed to waste their time and resources. Marcus grew frustrated. I knew this from the increasing frequency of Cross's reports, which I obtained through a source in the investigative community. Each report said essentially the same thing. Subject engaged in routine activities. No unusual financial transactions detected. No meetings with unidentified parties. No suspicious behavior observed. By day 20, Marcus was calling Thomas Brennan daily, demanding updates, asking why they weren't finding anything. Brennan, according to Rebecca's sources, was advising patience and caution. The investigation was only a third complete, he'd say. Evidence took time to develop. Elena pushed harder. I intercepted an encrypted message she sent to Marcus around day 25. Maybe we need to create evidence if we can't find it naturally. I know people who could help. Marcus, to his credit, refused. He was calculating enough to understand that fabricating evidence during active litigation would destroy him if discovered. But the message showed how desperate they were becoming, how the 60-day deadline was creating pressure that led to dangerous thinking. While Marcus hunted for evidence that didn't exist, I was completing work that had consumed 2 years of my life. The investigation of Jonathan Pierce had been painstaking, built piece by piece from fragments of information gathered through dozens of sources. Financial records obtained through legal discovery in unrelated cases. Testimony from former Harper & Associates employees I'd tracked down and interviewed. Email trails I'd reconstructed from backup servers. Corporate filings that showed patterns of money movement designed to be invisible. By day 30, I had 90% of what I needed. The shell companies Jonathan had created. The offshore accounts where money disappeared. The falsified invoices that made embezzlement look like legitimate business expenses. The board meeting notes that had been altered after the fact. The audit reports that had been suppressed. What I still needed was proof of timing. Evidence that connected the embezzlement directly to my father's death, that showed Jonathan had motive to eliminate a man who was about to expose him. I found it on day 45 in a file I'd almost overlooked. A former accountant at Harper & Associates had died 8 months ago, natural causes, at age 73. His estate was being settled by his daughter, who'd hired an attorney to handle the paperwork. That attorney had discovered old business files her father had kept at home, decades of documents he'd apparently never thrown away. Among those documents was a faxed contract dated 2 weeks before my father's death. A transfer agreement between Harper & Associates and a shell company called Meridian Holdings, LLC, moving $1.8 million offshore for consulting services. The contract was signed by Jonathan Pierce on behalf of Harper & Associates and by someone named David Chen on behalf of Meridian Holdings. I traced Meridian Holdings. Registered in Delaware, dissolved 3 months after the transfer, no assets remaining. David Chen was a name that appeared on incorporation documents, but had no other digital footprint. An alias, most likely, or someone paid to sign paperwork without asking questions. Cross-referencing the timing, I found that my father had scheduled an emergency board meeting for the week he died. The meeting agenda in my father's handwriting on a calendar his assistant had saved read, "Financial irregularities, offshore transfers, Pierce involvement." The $1.8 million had been moved on October 3rd. The board meeting was scheduled for October 18th. My father died on October 10th, 8 days before he would have presented evidence to the board that Jonathan Pierce had embezzled nearly $2 million. I sat in my apartment with the faxed contract in my hands, finally holding the piece that connected everything. Motive, opportunity, a clear timeline showing that Jonathan had every reason to ensure my father never made it to that board meeting. This was enough. This was what I'd spent 2 years searching for. Combined with everything else I'd gathered, this was sufficient to file criminal referrals with the FBI and state authorities. Evidence of embezzlement, evidence of fraud, and strong circumstantial evidence suggesting Jonathan Pierce had arranged my father's death to prevent exposure. But I didn't file it immediately. I waited. Marcus's 60 days hadn't expired yet. If I filed now, the investigation into Jonathan might inadvertently help Marcus by creating chaos that would distract from the divorce settlement deadline. I needed Marcus's time to run out. First, needed the contract clause to activate and lock away his access to the family trust. So I documented everything, organized all evidence into files that could be submitted at a moment's notice, and waited. Marcus had 13 days left. 13 days to find evidence that didn't exist. 13 days to become more desperate, more willing to take risks, more likely to make mistakes I could use later. While he was hunting for her mistakes, she was hunting for the truth. On day 52 of the 60-day countdown, Jonathan Pierce delivered what he probably thought was a killing blow. Rebecca called me at 7 in the morning, her voice tight with controlled urgency. "Jonathan Pierce just submitted a forensic report to the court claiming you hacked into Marcus's company email system 8 months ago. Thomas Brennan filed an emergency motion 30 minutes ago requesting immediate asset freezes. We have a hearing at 2 this afternoon." I was already at my laptop pulling up the court filing system, downloading the documents as Rebecca spoke. The forensic report was 43 pages long, dense with technical language charts showing IP addresses and access logs, timestamps of alleged unauthorized entries into Marcus's email server. It looked devastatingly thorough, professional, the kind of report that would convince a judge that serious criminal activity had occurred. "They're claiming you stole confidential business information," Rebecca continued. "Corporate strategies, client lists, financial projections. If this is real, Olivia, it's not just civil liability. This could be criminal charges, computer fraud, corporate espionage." I read through the report while Rebecca talked my mind, automatically cataloging details, looking for inconsistencies. The technical language was too perfect, too precise. Real forensic discoveries had messiness, had ambiguities, had qualifications from the investigator about confidence levels and alternative explanations. This read like it had been designed rather than discovered. The emergency hearing that afternoon was brief and brutal. Judge Patricia Morrison reviewed the forensic report, listened to Thomas Brennan's argument that Olivia Harper had engaged in criminal hacking to gain advantage in divorce proceedings, and granted a temporary asset freeze on 40% of my accessible accounts, pending further investigation. $600,000 frozen, inaccessible, until the court could determine whether the hacking allegations were legitimate. Marcus sat in the courtroom with an expression I'd never seen before, pure triumph. Catherine Wellington attended for the first time, sitting behind her son, her face showing satisfaction that probably felt like vindication. Elena stood in the back of the courtroom, watching with an expression I couldn't quite read. For the first time since this all began, I appeared to be losing. That night, I hired David Kim, a white-hat hacker, who'd testified as an expert witness in dozens of high-profile cases. I sent him the forensic report and asked a simple question: "Is this real?" He called me back 6 hours later. "It's fabricated. Very well done, but fabricated. The access logs are too clean. Real hacking leaves more digital debris, failed login attempts, proxy server artifacts, inconsistencies in timestamp sequencing. This looks like someone created the evidence after the fact, using administrative access to a device to generate logs that looked like remote intrusion. Can you prove it? Give me 48 hours. 2 days later, David sent me a report of his own. He'd traced the creation of the fake evidence to a specific laptop, my old work laptop that had been stored at the office I'd shared with Elena. Someone with physical access to that device had used it to create false login records, manipulated system logs to show external access that never occurred, and generated the appearance of email theft that had never happened. The person who'd done it had made one critical mistake. During one session of creating the false evidence, they'd briefly connected to their home Wi-Fi network. That connection was logged and the IP address traced back to an apartment in my old neighborhood. Elena Ross's apartment. She'd fabricated the entire hacking claim, used my old laptop to create false evidence, then somehow passed that evidence to Jonathan Pierce, who'd packaged it into an official-looking forensic report and submitted it to the court. I sat with David's report in my hands, understanding what this meant. I had proof of fraud. Proof that Elena had committed a serious crime by creating false evidence in a legal proceeding. Proof that could not only clear my name, but destroy her completely. And I decided not to use it yet. Rebecca was stunned when I told her. This proves the allegations are false. We could get the asset freeze lifted immediately. We could have Elena arrested. Why wait? Because revealing it now shows our hand. Marcus and Jonathan will know we have the capability to uncover their fabrications. They'll be more careful. More importantly, I want to see what else they'll try in the 8 days remaining. Desperate people make bigger mistakes. You're gambling with $600,000. It's a calculated risk. That money is frozen, not gone, and I need those 8 days for something else. I spent the next 72 hours finalizing the documentation against Jonathan Pierce. Every piece of evidence I'd gathered over 2 years, organized into files that would make sense to federal investigators. The embezzlement trail, the shell companies, the offshore transfers, the falsified invoices, the suppressed audit reports, and most importantly, the timeline showing that my father had been about to expose Jonathan 2 weeks before he died in a convenient accident. On day 56 of Marcus's 60-day investigation period, I walked into the FBI field office with Rebecca Stone and delivered a criminal referral. Not a civil lawsuit. Not a complaint to a business regulatory agency. A formal request for criminal investigation of Jonathan Pierce for embezzlement fraud and potential involvement in Richard Harper's death. The special agent who received the filing was a woman named Catherine Reeves. Someone Rebecca had identified as having experience with complex financial crimes. She reviewed the summary I'd prepared, glanced through the supporting documentation, and said she'd assign investigators to review the materials. 3 days later, the IRS opened a parallel investigation into Jonathan's offshore accounts and tax reporting. While Marcus celebrated what he thought was his victory with the fabricated hacking evidence, while Catherine smiled and Elena congratulated herself on a successful fraud, federal investigators were beginning to examine Jonathan Pierce's financial history with the kind of thorough attention that destroys carefully constructed lies. Marcus had 4 days left in his 60-day window. 4 days to find real evidence that didn't exist. 4 days before the contract clause activated and locked away his access to the family trust fund. And Jonathan Pierce had just become the target of 2 federal investigations that would consume his time, his resources, and eventually his freedom. She let them think they caught her while she was closing a bigger trap. The cafe where I met Victoria was deliberately unremarkable. A small place in a neighborhood neither of us had any connection to the kind of establishment where people came for coffee and quiet conversation without attracting attention. I arrived 15 minutes early, chose a table in the back corner with clear sightlines to the entrance, and waited. Victoria Wellington walked in at exactly 3 o'clock, which told me something about the woman who'd spent 12 years hiding. Punctual people don't survive long on the run, unless punctuality is a discipline they've maintained deliberately, a way to control the chaos. She looked different from the photographs I'd studied. 12 years had changed her, not just aging, but transforming. The confident young woman who'd married Marcus had been replaced by someone who'd learned to make herself invisible. Plain clothes, minimal makeup, hair styled to be forgettable. But her eyes were sharp, constantly scanning, assessing threats, even in this quiet cafe. I stood when she approached. "Thank you for meeting me." Victoria sat across from me without pleasantries. "I'm here because I'm curious, and because I want to see what kind of woman married Marcus after me." We ordered coffee from a server who seemed to understand this conversation wasn't for interruption. When she left, Victoria looked at me directly for the first time. "You wanted to talk before lawyers get involved. Why?" "Because I think we might have common interests," I said, "and because I suspect Jonathan Pierce is using you the same way he's used everyone else in this situation." Something shifted in Victoria's expression. Recognition, maybe. Or confirmation of a suspicion she'd already harbored. "Tell me your story," I said. "The real one, not the version that made it into police reports." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. Then she began talking, and the story that emerged was darker than the sanitized version I'd pieced together from public records. "Catherine Wellington had never accepted her," Victoria said. "Not because of class or education, but because Victoria refused to be controlled. She'd had her own career, her own money, her own opinions. Catherine saw that as a threat to family structure, to the natural order where Wellington men led and Wellington wives supported. The pressure had been constant. Small cruelties at family gatherings, public criticism of Victoria's choices. Marcus, caught between his mother and his wife, had sided with his mother more often than not. He'd begun controlling Victoria's access to money, questioning her purchases, requiring approval for expenses above certain amounts. When Victoria decided to file for divorce, she'd consulted with an attorney, begun organizing her financial documentation. 2 days later, she'd discovered all her bank accounts had been frozen. The bank claimed suspected fraudulent activity, though they couldn't provide details. Her credit cards stopped working. Her access to joint accounts was blocked. I was terrified. Victoria said, her voice steady but her eyes showing the memory of that fear. I didn't know if it was legal or illegal, didn't know who to trust, didn't know if Marcus or Catherine had the power to make me disappear entirely. So I ran. She'd left in the middle of the night with 2 suitcases and $3,000 in cash she'd hidden for emergencies. Drove to Canada, established a new identity through methods she didn't elaborate on, and spent 12 years working under a false name, always watching over her shoulder. 7 years after I left, I saw the death declaration. Marcus had me declared legally dead so he could inherit my share of the estate settlement. Everything I was entitled to in divorce went to him because I was deceased. I listened without judgment, understanding the psychology of what Victoria had endured. She'd been isolated, controlled, financially trapped, and ultimately forced to choose between fighting a system stacked against her or disappearing entirely. "Why come back now?" I asked. Victoria's expression hardened. "Because Jonathan Pierce found me. He said he could help me reclaim the inheritance Catherine stole. Said he had lawyers who could challenge the death declaration, prove I was alive, force the Wellingtons to return what was mine." What did he ask for in exchange? That I create legal complications for you and Marcus. Challenge the validity of your marriage by proving Marcus's first marriage was never legally dissolved. Tie up courts, create chaos, make everyone's life difficult. I leaned forward slightly. And you believed him, that he'd actually help you? Victoria met my eyes. No, something felt wrong. But I wanted to believe because the alternative was staying hidden forever. I pulled a folder from my bag, extracted a single document, and slid it across the table. This is evidence that Jonathan Pierce embezzled $1.8 million from my father's company. 2 weeks after stealing that money, my father died in a convenient accident. The car crash that killed him happened 8 days before a board meeting where my father planned to expose Jonathan's crimes. Victoria's face went pale as she read. "Jonathan didn't find you to help you," I continued. He found you to use you. You're a weapon to him, a way to create legal chaos while he covers his tracks. And when he's done with you when you're no longer useful, do you really think he'll let you walk away? You were already declared dead once, Victoria. How easy would it be to make that permanent? The silence stretched between us. I could see her processing understanding, connecting pieces she'd deliberately not examined too closely because she'd wanted so desperately to believe she could reclaim what had been stolen. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally. "An alliance. Work with me instead of against me. We take down both Jonathan and Marcus through legal channels. You get your inheritance back legitimately through proper court proceedings. I get justice for my father. And we both get free of the men who used us and thought we were too weak to fight back." Victoria looked at me for a long moment, this woman who'd spent 12 years running, 12 years looking over her shoulder, 12 years living half a life because powerful people had made her disappear. "I'm tired of hiding," she said quietly. "Then stop hiding. Stand up. Fight back. Let them see that the woman they tried to erase is very much alive and very much done being afraid." Victoria smiled, and it was the first genuine expression I'd seen from her. "When do we start?" Two women betrayed by the same men found common ground in revenge. Day 58 arrived with the kind of pressure that makes people do desperate things. I knew Marcus was feeling it because the signs were everywhere visible even from my careful distance. The court hearing on the hacking allegations had gone poorly for him. David Kim, my white hat hacker expert, had testified for 90 minutes, methodically dismantling the forensic report Jonathan Pierce had submitted. He'd explained to Judge Morrison exactly how the evidence could have been fabricated, showed digital artifacts that indicated creation rather than discovery, pointed out inconsistencies that a legitimate forensic investigation would have noted and explained. The judge hadn't dismissed the allegations outright, but she'd ordered an independent forensic review, which meant more time, more delays, more doubt cast on what Marcus had thought was his winning evidence. Thomas Brennan called an emergency meeting with Marcus that afternoon. I knew this because Rebecca had sources in Brennan's office, paralegals who understood the value of information and knew how to share it discreetly. According to those sources, Brennan had been blunt. "You have 2 days to find legitimate evidence of financial fraud or material misrepresentation. If you can't produce something credible by day 60, the contract clause activates. You'll lose access to the family trust fund for at least 2 years. Marcus apparently had not taken this well. He'd called his mother immediately after the meeting right there in Brennan's office, his voice loud enough that the paralegal working late had heard parts of the conversation through the closed door. Catherine Wellington's response had been devastating in its coldness. "I warned you," she'd said, her voice carrying the chill that only a mother disappointed in her son can produce. "I told you not to lay hands on that woman. I told you she was different from Victoria, that she wouldn't break or run. But you didn't listen. You acted out of anger instead of strategy, and now you're facing consequences I can't fix." For perhaps the first time in his life, Marcus had asked his mother for help and been refused. The family that had protected him, enabled him, shielded him from every consequence of every poor decision was stepping back, watching him drown without throwing a rope. The paralegal reported that after hanging up, Marcus had sat in silence for several minutes before leaving Brennan's office without another word. I received this information while having dinner with Victoria in a different, unremarkable restaurant. We'd been meeting regularly since our first conversation, building strategy, coordinating our separate but aligned objectives. Victoria had proven to be sharper than her years in hiding might suggest, with a detailed memory for Wellington family finances and a deep understanding of Catherine's methods. "Marcus always relied on his mother to solve his problems," Victoria said when I told her about the phone call. "She's spent his entire life running interference, smoothing over his mistakes, making consequences disappear. He's never had to face real accountability. Until now." "Until now," Victoria agreed. Elena made her move that evening, sending me an email that was carefully crafted to sound conciliatory. She wrote that she'd been thinking about our working relationship, about how much she'd valued being my assistant, about how sorry she was that things had become complicated. She suggested we meet for coffee. Just to talk, no lawyers, no formal agenda. The email was transparent in its desperation. Elena could see Marcus weakening and was trying to position herself as a bridge, someone who could potentially help both sides reach an understanding. She probably thought that showing loyalty to me now after spending months betraying me to Marcus would somehow earn her protection when everything collapsed. I responded politely but vaguely, thanking her for reaching out, saying I'd consider her suggestion, but needed time to think about whether such a meeting would be productive. I committed to nothing, promised nothing, left her in uncertainty. What Elena didn't know was that I'd already forwarded David Kim's analysis of the fabricated hacking evidence to the FBI. Not as a formal complaint, not requesting immediate action, but simply for their files. Information they might find useful when conducting their investigation of Jonathan Pierce, given that Elena had apparently been working with him to create false evidence. A federal file now existed with Elena Ross's name on it, documenting her participation in evidence fabrication, ready to be activated whenever it became useful. Elena thought she was maneuvering cleverly between two sides. She was actually creating a documented trail of her own crimes. Marcus tried calling Jonathan Pierce on day 59. I knew this because the monitoring I'd placed on certain communication channels showed repeated attempts from Marcus's phone to Jonathan's private number. Each call went unanswered. Marcus sent emails. No response. He tried Jonathan's office. The secretary said Mr. Pierce was unavailable and couldn't say when he'd be reachable. Jonathan had gone silent because he was dealing with a crisis of his own. The FBI investigation into Harper and Associates had begun in earnest. Federal investigators had started requesting documents from the company, interviewing current and former employees, examining financial records. The IRS had opened parallel inquiries into Jonathan's personal finances and offshore accounts. Jonathan Pierce, who'd seemed so powerful, so untouchable, who'd orchestrated so many pieces of this elaborate game, was suddenly too busy protecting himself to worry about Marcus Wellington's divorce problems. Marcus didn't understand why Jonathan wasn't responding. He couldn't see the federal investigation happening quietly in the background. He just knew that the man who'd introduced him to Olivia, who'd seemed helpful and supportive, who'd provided the fabricated evidence about hacking, had vanished exactly when Marcus needed him most. The powerful, I'd learned long ago, are only powerful when they have resources and allies. Remove those supports and they collapse faster than anyone expects. Marcus had built his life on family money, his mother's protection, and Jonathan's assistance. Now the money was about to be locked away. His mother had withdrawn support, and Jonathan had disappeared. For the first time, Marcus Wellington was truly alone, facing consequences, with no one to save him. When the powerful realize they're alone, panic sets in fast. Day 60 arrived on a Wednesday morning in late April. I woke at my usual time, made coffee, and opened my laptop to check the automated systems I'd set up months ago. At midnight, the contract clause had activated precisely as designed. The transfer of $4.2 million from Marcus Wellington's control to a third-party trust fund managed by an independent trustee was already complete. Marcus no longer had access to the family money that had funded his entire life. The trust agreement was clear: he couldn't touch those funds until he demonstrated financial independence through stable personal income of at least $200,000 annually for 24 consecutive months. For a man who'd never earned significant money independently, who'd always relied on inherited wealth, this was effectively a sentence to poverty by his own standards. Rebecca called at 8. "It's done. The trust transfer completed at 12:01 this morning. Brennan just filed a motion requesting emergency review, but the contract language is ironclad. There's no basis for reversal." How is Marcus responding? According to my sources, he's been in Brennan's office since 7. They're going through the contract clause line by line, looking for any technicality they can challenge. They won't find anything. The fallout began within hours. Vanessa Caldwell, the senator's daughter Marcus had planned to marry after our divorce finalized, released a brief statement through her family's publicist. After careful consideration, Vanessa Caldwell and Marcus Wellington have decided to end their engagement. We wish each other well. The statement was diplomatic, professional, and devastating. Senator Caldwell's daughter had publicly severed ties with Marcus exactly when his financial situation collapsed. The political committees Marcus had been courting withdrew their informal support. Campaign consultants stopped returning calls. Donors who'd expressed interest in funding his eventual run for office suddenly had other priorities. A man who'd lost access to family wealth and been abandoned by a senator's daughter was not someone political organizations wanted to invest in. Catherine Wellington's world began crumbling through association. Board members from the family company called her expressing concern about Marcus's judgment, his decision-making, his ability to handle the responsibilities they'd been grooming him for. The slap at Christmas dinner, the failed divorce strategy, the loss of the trust fund. All of it painted a picture of someone unreliable, someone who made decisions based on emotion rather than calculation. The phone call came on Thursday afternoon. I almost didn't answer when I saw the Wellington home number on my caller ID, but curiosity won. Olivia. Catherine Wellington's voice was different from every other time I'd heard it. Smaller somehow. Uncertain. I need to speak with you. I waited, saying nothing. I was wrong about you. She continued, the words clearly difficult for a woman who'd spent her life being certain about everything. I thought you were like Victoria. I saw the intelligence, the independence, and I was terrified that history would repeat itself, that you would take from Marcus the way Victoria took from us. So I tested you. I pushed you. I tried to make you leave before you could hurt my son. You succeeded, I said quietly. I did leave. But not the way Victoria did. You didn't run, you didn't hide. You stood up and you fought back and you were right to do it. Marcus shouldn't have touched you. I shouldn't have created the situation that led to that moment. I was trying to protect him from what I thought you might do, and instead, I pushed him into doing something unforgivable. The apology hung in the air between us. Part of me wanted to accept it, wanted to acknowledge the fear that had motivated Catherine's cruelty, wanted to offer forgiveness that might ease the guilt I could hear in her voice. But I thought about 18 months of insults, 18 months of public humiliation, of tests designed to break me, of deliberate cruelty masked as family tradition. I thought about Catherine sitting at the head of that Christmas dinner table smiling as her son struck me, satisfied that she'd finally put me in what she considered my proper place. You had 18 months to see who I really was, I said. 18 months to treat me with basic respect, to consider that maybe I wasn't Victoria, that maybe I deserved to be judged on my own actions rather than your fears. You chose to spend that time testing me, hurting me, trying to drive me away. Now that I've won, now that your son has lost, you want to apologize? I know it's too late. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. I was wrong. Some opportunities don't come back once they're lost, Catherine. Respect doesn't arrive late, it arrives on time or not at all. The silence stretched for several seconds before Catherine spoke again, her voice barely audible. I understand. The call ended after 2 minutes. I sat looking at my phone, feeling less satisfaction than I'd expected. Winning didn't feel as sweet as I'd imagined during all those months of planning. It felt necessary, justified, but not particularly triumphant. Rebecca called again that evening. The judge denied Brennan's motion for emergency review. The trust transfer stands. Marcus is officially without access to family funds until he can prove financial independence. Good. You don't sound happy. I'm satisfied. But this isn't over, Rebecca. Marcus was just the obstacle in front of the real target. Jonathan Pierce is still out there, still facing investigation, but not yet charged. Elena fabricated evidence and hasn't faced any consequences. Victoria's helping us, but she has her own agenda that might not always align with mine. We've won round 1. The war is just beginning. Winning the battle doesn't mean the war is over. Jonathan Pierce's counterattack came 3 days after Marcus lost access to the trust fund. The lawsuit was filed in civil court on a Monday morning, delivered to Rebecca's office by courier before 9 a.m. I was having coffee with Victoria when Rebecca called. Jonathan just sued you for defamation and tortious interference. He's claiming you've been making implicit accusations about his involvement in your father's death, damaging his reputation and business relationships. I set down my coffee cup carefully. How much is he asking for? $5 million in damages. But that's not the point. The point is he's forcing you into court. You'll have to present evidence to defend yourself, which means exposing what you have before the criminal investigation is complete. Or you don't present evidence and he wins by default, which destroys your credibility for any future criminal case. It was elegant in a cruel way. Jonathan had turned my investigation into a liability. By suing me for defamation, he'd created a situation where I'd have to reveal my evidence prematurely or suffer a legal defeat that would make that evidence look like the desperate accusations of a woman who'd already been proven wrong in court. Victoria watched my face as I processed this. What does it mean? It means Jonathan is trying to force me to show my hand before I'm ready. I put the phone on speaker so Victoria could hear Rebecca's explanation. The lawsuit is aggressive, Rebecca said. He's filed multiple motions requesting expedited discovery, asking for immediate depositions, trying to compress the timeline. His lawyers are Whitmore and Associates, the firm that specializes in destroying people through procedural warfare. They'll bury us in motions, drain resources, make every step as expensive and time-consuming as possible. I thought through the options, seeing the trap from every angle. Can we delay? Yes, we can file counter-motions, request extensions, drag this out for 2 or 3 years if we're strategic about it. But eventually, Olivia, you'll have to go to trial. And when you do, you'll need to present evidence strong enough to prove your accusations weren't defamatory. If the evidence isn't conclusive, if there are gaps or ambiguities, Jonathan wins and your criminal case dies before it starts. The genuine dilemma settled over me. If I went to trial now, my evidence was strong but not complete. Circumstantial proof of embezzlement, compelling timelines, suspicious patterns, but not the definitive proof that would survive Jonathan's expensive lawyers tearing it apart piece by piece. If I delayed, Jonathan would use that time to destroy more evidence, move more money, possibly flee to a jurisdiction without extradition. Victoria leaned forward. What if he had to fight on 2 fronts? I looked at her, seeing the calculation in her eyes. I'm still technically Marcus's wife, she continued. The death declaration was filed while I was alive, which means it's invalid. Which means the divorce settlement that followed was also invalid. Which means the asset distributions from 12 years ago need to be audited and potentially reversed. Rebecca's voice came through the phone with new energy. You could file a motion to audit Wellington family assets from the period after your disappearance. Any transactions Marcus participated in, any business dealings, any financial arrangements, all subject to review. Including, Victoria said slowly, transactions with Jonathan Pierce. I remember Marcus and Jonathan had several joint business ventures during my marriage. Real estate deals, investment partnerships. If those deals continued after I left, and if community property was used, I have standing to audit them. The strategy crystallized. Jonathan's lawsuit against me would proceed, but simultaneously, Victoria would open a second front. Her audit request would force Jonathan to defend his financial dealings with Marcus, produce documentation, submit to depositions. His lawyers would have to split their attention between attacking me and defending him. File it, I told Victoria. File the audit request and make it comprehensive. Every business dealing, every joint venture, every financial transaction between the Wellington family and Jonathan Pierce from the time you disappeared until now. Rebecca was already typing. I could hear the keyboard clicking through the phone. This is good. This changes the dynamics completely. Jonathan thought he was cornering Olivia alone. He didn't account for Victoria. Over the next week, Victoria's lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia Mendez, who specialized in complex estate litigation, filed a motion that was masterful in its thoroughness. She requested audit access to 12 years of Wellington family financial records, specifically focusing on any transactions involving Jonathan Pierce. The legal argument was sound. If Victoria was alive when declared dead, the subsequent asset distribution was invalid, and any business dealings using those improperly distributed assets needed review. Jonathan's response revealed everything I needed to know. instead of the confident, aggressive legal maneuvering he'd used against me. His lawyers filed defensive motions trying to limit the scope of Victoria's audit request. They argued it was overly broad, unnecessarily invasive, irrelevant to the estate settlement question. They were protecting something. I watched the legal filings accumulate, seeing Jonathan's strategy fracture under pressure from two directions. His lawyers at Whitmore and Associates were now divided between prosecuting the defamation case against me and defending against Victoria's audit demands. Resources that should have been concentrated on crushing me were instead scattered across multiple proceedings. For the first time since my father's death, I saw Jonathan Pierce responding reactively instead of proactively. He'd always been 3 steps ahead, always controlled the board, always positioned pieces before his opponents knew the game had started. Now he was scrambling, deploying defenses, showing signs of strain. Victoria met my eyes across the table in my apartment where we'd been coordinating strategy. He thought I was controllable, thought I'd do what he wanted because I was motivated by money and afraid of the Wellingtons. He underestimated you, I said. He underestimated both of us. He thought he was hunting one woman, now he faced 2. The FBI contacted Elena Ross on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after Victoria's audit motion had split Jonathan's legal focus. I knew because the agent handling the interview, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, called Rebecca afterward to confirm that the digital evidence fabrication complaint I'd filed was still active or had been withdrawn. "We've questioned Ms. Ross about her role in creating false forensic evidence," Agent Mitchell said. "She's cooperating, but she's clearly terrified. She asked if she was being arrested. I told her not at this time, but that the investigation is ongoing." "What did she say about who she was working with?" I asked. "She initially claimed she acted alone trying to help Marcus Wellington in the divorce. When pressed about Jonathan Pierce, she became evasive, said she'd never met him in person, only communicated through encrypted channels. She's protecting someone or she's afraid of someone. Possibly both." I thought about Elena in that interview room, realizing for the first time the seriousness of what she'd done. Fabricating evidence wasn't a mistake you could apologize away. It was a federal crime with real consequences. According to sources I'd cultivated, Elena tried calling Marcus immediately after the FBI interview. He didn't answer. She called 3 more times over the next hour. Each call went to voicemail. Marcus, dealing with his own collapsed world, had no interest in being associated with someone facing potential criminal charges. Elena called Jonathan Pierce next. I knew this because the call was logged on systems I'd been monitoring. Jonathan answered, listened for approximately 40 seconds, then said 5 words that my source reported verbatim. "I don't know you. Stop calling." The line went dead. Elena had been discarded. Her usefulness expired. She tried finding legal representation, called 7 attorneys over the next 2 days. Each conversation ended the same way. The lawyers would listen to her situation, then explain that they had conflicts of interest. Some represented the Wellington family. Others had relationships with Harper and Associates. One had recently been retained by Victoria Wellington's estate claim. The legal community in our area wasn't large, and I'd been thorough in creating relationships that would make it difficult for Elena to find representation. She was alone. Completely alone. The people who'd used her, Marcus, who'd paid her to spy Jonathan, who'd convinced her to fabricate evidence, had abandoned her the moment she became a liability. Elena had thought she was a player in an elaborate game, someone with agency and power. She'd just discovered she was a piece to be sacrificed, a pawn expendable, the moment the board shifted. I didn't push for criminal prosecution. 2 weeks after the FBI interview, I formally withdrew the complaint about the fabricated evidence. Agent Mitchell called to ask why. "Because the legal system will punish her if necessary," I told her. "I don't need to. Her real punishment is something else entirely." That punishment manifested quietly, inexorably over the following weeks. The headhunting firm that had originally placed Elena with me quietly removed her from their roster. When she called to ask why, they cited professional concerns and credibility issues without elaborating. The references she'd relied on, former employers' professors from her MBA program, stopped responding to verification requests from potential employers. No one publicly denounced her. No one wrote negative reviews. They simply stopped vouching for her. Elena applied to 43 positions over 6 weeks. I know because Rebecca had sources tracking her activity. Each application went unanswered or received polite rejection emails citing other candidates whose qualifications better match our needs. No company would tell her the real reason that phone calls had been made. Quiet conversations had occurred, word had spread through professional networks that Elena Ross was someone you didn't hire. She wasn't publicly shamed. There were no news articles about her fabricating evidence, no social media campaigns destroying her reputation. The punishment was silent, invisible to anyone not watching closely. But within the industry where she'd built her career, everyone who mattered knew. Don't hire Elena Ross. The Whisper campaign was more devastating than any public scandal would have been. Public scandals eventually fade, memories dim, people move on. But professional networks have long memories, and trust once broken is nearly impossible to rebuild. By late May, Elena's LinkedIn profile showed she was no longer seeking opportunities in executive assistance or corporate administration. She'd retrained as a barista at a coffee shop chain, a job that didn't check professional references, didn't care about her MBA, didn't ask about her previous employment. Her career was over at 29. The email arrived on a Tuesday evening. I was reviewing documents with Victoria when it appeared in my inbox. No subject line, just Elena's personal email address as the sender. I opened it because I was curious what she'd say after everything that had happened. The message was brief, stripped of the calculated polish Elena usually brought to her communications. Raw in a way that suggested multiple drafts, each one probably more desperate than the last. I'm sorry for everything. I was wrong about so many things. I thought I understood what I was doing, who I was helping, what I was building toward. I didn't. I destroyed my own life trying to hurt yours. And I understand now that there's no excuse for that. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Please. I read it twice. Felt nothing. No satisfaction in her suffering. No triumph in her downfall. No anger at her betrayal. Just nothing. I closed the email and deleted it. Victoria looked up from the documents she was reviewing. What was that? Elena apologizing. Are you going to respond? No. Because some mistakes can't be apologized away. Some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt with words. Elena had made her choices to betray, to spy, to fabricate evidence. She'd done those things believing there would be rewards, believing she was building toward something meaningful. Now she was learning that actions have consequences that apologies can't erase. The silence was the answer. The only answer. Elena checked her email obsessively over the next week. I know because the monitoring software I'd never removed from her devices showed her logging in every few hours, refreshing her inbox, searching for a response that never came. On day 8, the email checking stopped. She'd finally understood. Silence was the only answer she deserved. The evidence came together like pieces of a puzzle I'd been assembling for 2 years, each fragment waiting for the others to reveal the complete picture. Victoria's contribution proved invaluable. 12 years ago, before she'd fled, she'd kept meticulous records of Wellington family finances. Not because she suspected Jonathan specifically, but because she'd been raised to document everything important. And as Marcus's wife, she'd had access to family business dealings. When she ran, she'd taken copies of those records with her insurance, she'd called it, in case the Wellingtons ever tried to claim she'd stolen assets. Those records showed the beginning of Jonathan's relationship with Marcus Business Ventures. They'd partnered on real estate deals, where Wellington family money had flowed into shell companies that Jonathan controlled. Victoria hadn't understood the significance at the time, but now, cross-referenced with everything I'd gathered, the patterns became clear. Jonathan had been embedding himself into the Wellington family finances for over a decade, creating legitimate-looking business relationships that masked the infrastructure he'd use later to move stolen money. Marcus's contribution was accidental, but equally valuable. During the divorce proceedings, Thomas Brennan had submitted hundreds of pages of financial documents as part of the asset disclosure process. Most of it was irrelevant to the divorce itself, just comprehensive documentation designed to show Marcus had nothing to hide. Buried in those documents were email exchanges between Marcus and Jonathan about joint investments, including several that had been funded with money from Harper and Associates during the period when Jonathan was taking over my father's company. Marcus hadn't understood the significance he'd just been copying Jonathan on investment opportunities, the way wealthy men do when networking. But those emails created a paper trail, connecting Jonathan's embezzlement from my father's company directly to investments made through Wellington family accounts. Money stolen from Harper and Associates had been laundered through legitimate-looking business deals, with Marcus making it nearly impossible to trace without both sets of records. I spent 3 weeks in my apartment with Victoria and Rebecca spreading documents across every surface building, a chronological timeline that showed exactly how Jonathan had constructed his embezzlement scheme. The full scope was breathtaking. $4.5 million stolen over a 3-year period, moved through a network of shell companies registered in Delaware, Nevada, and the Cayman Islands. Each transfer looked legitimate on its surface: consulting fees, service payments, investment returns. But when you traced the companies receiving the payments, they all led back to Jonathan through layers of corporate structures designed to obscure ownership. The faxed contract I'd found weeks earlier was the linchpin. $1.8 million transferred to Meridian Holdings LLC 2 weeks before my father's death. But it wasn't just the amount or the timing that mattered. It was the signature. I'd hired a forensic document examiner, a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen, who testified in federal fraud cases. She analyzed the signature on that contract, supposedly my father's signature authorizing the transfer, and determined it was forged. The analysis showed microscopic differences in pen pressure, stroke angle, and letter formation that indicated someone had traced my father's signature from another document, rather than him signing it himself. Jonathan had forged my father's authorization to steal $1.8 million. When my father discovered the theft and scheduled a board meeting to expose it, Jonathan had arranged an accident. The evidence for my father's murder was circumstantial but compelling. Richard Harper's calendar showed the emergency board meeting scheduled for October 18th. The agenda in his handwriting specified financial irregularities and Pierce involvement. My father died on October 10th, 8 days before that meeting. His private attorney, Daniel Morrison, who'd been helping him build the case against Jonathan, died 3 months later in a hiking accident. The fire that destroyed Morrison's office and files occurred 2 weeks after Morrison's death. 2 men who knew about Jonathan's embezzlement. 2 convenient accidents. 2 investigations that concluded there was no foul play. I found one more critical piece, a witness who'd been too afraid to come forward at the time, but had kept evidence just in case. Gerald Winters had been the senior accountant at Harper and Associates during the embezzlement period. Now 74 and living in Portugal, retired for a decade, Gerald had watched Jonathan's financial maneuvers with growing suspicion. He'd kept copies of suspicious invoices, transfer authorizations, and email exchanges, not because he'd planned to use them, but because something felt wrong and he wanted documentation if questions ever arose. When I contacted him through a carefully worded letter explaining my investigation, Gerald agreed to provide sworn testimony and turn over his documentation. He'd stayed silent after my father's death because he'd been afraid of Jonathan, afraid of losing his pension, afraid of being the next convenient accident. But now, retired and living abroad with nothing left for Jonathan to threaten, Gerald was willing to talk. His testimony filled gaps in the evidence chain, confirmed that my father had discovered the embezzlement, verified that Jonathan had been increasingly anxious in the weeks before my father's death. By early June, I had everything assembled. A complete case showing embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and strong circumstantial evidence suggesting Jonathan Pierce had committed murder to hide his crimes. Rebecca and I met with FBI Special Agent Catherine Reeves and an IRS criminal investigation agent named Michael Torres. We presented them with 15 binders of evidence organized chronologically. Each document cross-referenced every claim supported by multiple sources. This wasn't a civil defamation defense. This was a criminal referral for federal prosecution. Agent Reeves spent 3 hours reviewing the materials during our initial meeting. When she finished, she looked up with an expression I recognized the look of someone seeing a case they knew they could win. "This is extremely thorough," she said. "You've essentially done our job for us." "I had 2 years and strong motivation," I replied. The FBI opened an official investigation within a week. The IRS followed with parallel tax evasion charges. Jonathan hadn't reported the embezzled funds, as income hadn't paid taxes on millions of dollars he'd stolen. Federal investigators began subpoenaing records from banks, shell companies, and business associates. Jonathan's assets started getting frozen as the investigation expanded. His business partners began distancing themselves immediately. Calls went unreturned. Meeting invitations were declined. The board of Harper & Associates, still technically under Jonathan's control, suddenly became very interested in reviewing his management decisions over the past 2 years. Jonathan tried fighting back through his lawyers filing motions to block subpoenas claiming the investigation was based on false allegations from a woman with a grudge. But federal investigators don't operate like civil courts. They move methodically, building cases brick by brick, unconcerned with the defendant's objections or timeline. The negotiation attempt came through an intermediary in late June. A lawyer I'd never heard of called Rebecca, saying he represented someone interested in resolving certain misunderstandings regarding Harper & Associates. The offer was transmitted formally 3 days later. Jonathan would return full control of Harper & Associates to me, pay $2 million in compensation for my father's estate, and publicly apologize for any mistakes in corporate governance that had occurred during the transition period. In exchange, I would withdraw the FBI referral and sign a non-disclosure agreement preventing me from discussing the matter publicly. $2 million. The company my father built. A public apology. For most people facing federal investigations that could take years and cost millions in legal fees, this would be an attractive settlement. Rebecca presented it to me in her office, laying out the pros and cons with her usual thoroughness. "It's a guaranteed outcome," she said. "You get the company, you get compensation, you avoid years of trial uncertainty. Federal criminal cases are hard to win, Olivia, even with strong evidence. Reasonable doubt is a high bar, and Jonathan can afford lawyers who are very good at creating doubt." I thought about my father, about the emergency board meeting he never got to attend, about Daniel Morrison, whose office burned 2 weeks after his death, about all the times Jonathan had looked at me with fatherly concern while plotting to use my marriage to Marcus as a way to keep me distracted and discredited. "No," I said. "Olivia, I don't need money, Rebecca. I have money. I don't need the company back through a settlement. I'll get it back through Jonathan's conviction when his assets are forfeited. What I need is for my father's death to be investigated properly, for Daniel Morrison's death to be reviewed, for Jonathan Pierce to face criminal consequences for what he did. Damn. This is a guaranteed outcome versus an uncertain trial. My father deserves justice. Real justice, not a settlement with a non-disclosure agreement that lets Jonathan buy his way out of murder. I've spent 2 years building this case. I'm not stopping now." The criminal referral was filed officially on June 28th. Federal investigators intensified their work. Grand jury subpoenas went out. Jonathan's lawyers filed motions to suppress evidence, to dismiss charges, to delay proceedings. Each motion was denied. There was no turning back now. Justice doesn't negotiate. The invitation to speak at the Women's Financial Leadership Conference arrived in September, 6 months after the divorce had finalized, and 3 months after I'd filed the criminal referral against Jonathan Pierce. The conference organizer, a woman named Margaret Chen, who ran a nonprofit focused on financial literacy, had read about my case in the business press and thought my perspective would be valuable. "We want someone who can talk about financial preparation in relationships," Margaret said during our initial call. "Not from a place of cynicism, but from practical experience. Someone who can teach women how to protect themselves legally without making it sound like they're planning for failure." I almost declined. Public speaking meant visibility, meant inviting attention to a chapter of my life I'd thought was closed. But then I thought about all the women who'd been in my position married to someone with more resources, more connections, more power, who hadn't known how to protect themselves, who'd lost everything because they'd trusted instead of prepared. "I'll do it," I told Margaret. "But I want to be clear, this isn't a revenge story. It's not about my ex-husband or my divorce. It's about practical tools that every woman should have regardless of whether her marriage succeeds or fails." That's exactly what we want. The conference was held in a hotel ballroom in Philadelphia, attended by approximately 400 women, most of them between 45 and 65. Professional women business owners, executives, women who'd built careers but might not have built the same protections in their personal lives. I stood backstage before my presentation, watching the audience settle into their seats, feeling a nervousness I hadn't anticipated. Rebecca, who'd come to support me, squeezed my shoulder. "You've presented to corporate boards, you've testified in depositions. This is just talking to people who need to hear what you have to say. It's different when it's personal. You're not making it personal. You're making it practical. That's the whole point." The moderator introduced me with a brief biography that mentioned my background in financial analysis, but didn't dwell on the divorce except to note that I'd recently navigated complex financial litigation. Professional, factual, appropriately vague. I walked onto the stage to polite applause and looked out at 400 faces, most of them women who'd lived long enough to understand that marriage was complicated, that love didn't always protect you, that preparation wasn't pessimism. "Thank you for having me," I began. "My topic today is financial independence and legal literacy for women, which sounds dry and technical until you need it. Then it becomes the difference between losing everything and protecting what's yours." I didn't mention Marcus by name, didn't describe the Christmas dinner, or the slap, or the 60-day contract clause. This wasn't my story I was telling, it was a framework, a set of tools, a survival manual disguised as a lecture on financial planning. I talked about prenuptial agreements, explaining them not as predictions of divorce, but as clarifications of expectations. "If you're getting married, you're already signing a contract," I said. "It's just that if you don't write your own, the state has written one for you. Most people have no idea what the default terms are until they're in divorce court discovering what they agreed to without knowing it." I explained asset protection structures, not hiding money, but maintaining independence. Having your own bank account isn't a sign that you don't trust your spouse. It's a sign that you understand financial autonomy is part of adult life. You don't need permission to maintain your own identity, financial or otherwise. I walked through the importance of understanding all household finances, even if one person handles the day-to-day management. You should be able to name every account, every investment, every asset. You should know where the documents are kept. Not because you're planning for the worst, but because you're an adult who should understand your own financial situation. The audience was silent, leaning forward, taking notes. I could see recognition on their faces, women who'd made some of these mistakes, who'd trusted too much or paid too little attention, who were thinking about daughters or friends who needed to hear this. I talked about legal documents. Every married person should have power of attorney healthcare directives, estate planning documents that were independent of spousal agreements. These aren't romantic documents. They're necessary ones, and they should be reviewed by your own lawyer, not the family lawyer, not your spouse's lawyer, your own representation. I explained spousal privilege and its limitations, corporate structures, and how they could be used or misused, the importance of maintaining professional networks independent of your partner's connections. I discussed the psychology of financial control, how it often starts subtly, how questioning purchases or requiring approvals can escalate into something more serious. "The time to protect yourself isn't when you see warning signs," I said. "It's before anything goes wrong. Because if you wait until you need protection, you're already operating from a position of weakness." 45 minutes passed quickly. I finished with the point I'd been building toward throughout the entire presentation. None of this means you should approach marriage with cynicism or distrust. It means you should approach it as an adult who understands that preparation and love aren't opposites. You can hope for the best while planning for alternatives. You can trust your partner while maintaining your own autonomy. You can build a life together while keeping the skills and resources to stand on your own if necessary. That's not pessimism. That's wisdom. The applause when I finished was different from the polite reception when I'd walked onto the stage. Louder, sustained, genuine. Women stood. I saw tears on some faces, fierce determination on others. The question and answer session that followed revealed just how much this topic resonated. Women asked specific questions about their situations, carefully phrased to avoid identifying details but clearly rooted in real circumstances. I answered each one practically without judgment, focusing on actionable steps rather than emotional validation. After the formal session ended, a line formed. Women waiting to speak to me privately to thank me to share their own stories in whispered conversations that wouldn't be overheard. A woman in her 50s told me about discovering her husband had secret accounts only after he died, leaving her to untangle finances she'd never understood. A woman in her 30s said she was engaged and planned to insist on a prenuptial agreement after hearing my presentation despite her fiancé's objections. A woman in her 60s said she wished she'd heard this speech 40 years ago. One woman, probably in her late 40s, approached with tears streaming down her face. I read about your divorce case in the news. The articles made it sound like a fight between powerful people. I didn't understand until now. You're very strong. I looked at her, this woman who was crying for reasons I didn't fully understand, and I thought about all the times people had misunderstood what strength meant. I'm not stronger than anyone, I said gently. I was just more prepared. That's the whole point. You don't need to be extraordinary. You just need to be informed and ready. The woman hugged me, thanked me, walked away, wiping her eyes. I didn't know that someone had recorded that exchange on their phone. Didn't know that I'm not stronger than anyone, I was just more prepared, would be clipped, shared, posted across social media platforms with tags about financial independence and women's empowerment. Didn't know it would appear in articles about divorce preparation, in financial planning, newsletters, in support group discussions. The quote spread in the way meaningful statements do in the digital age, quickly, broadly finding audiences I'd never intended to reach. It appeared on Instagram with aesthetic fonts over stock photos of professional women. It was quoted in blog posts about protecting yourself in marriage. It showed up in comment sections where women were discussing whether prenuptial agreements were unromantic. I didn't seek the publicity, didn't hire a PR firm or give additional interviews. The message resonated on its own, spreading because it touched something women needed to hear. That preparation wasn't the same as expecting failure, that protecting yourself wasn't a sign of weakness or distrust. Women who'd read about the divorce and pitied me, poor Olivia, married to that terrible man, began to see it differently. Not a victim story, but a case study in what preparation and careful planning could accomplish. People who'd dismissed me as just another divorcing wife realized I'd been operating at a level they hadn't recognized. The shift happened naturally, organically, without me trying to control it. My LinkedIn profile started getting connection requests from women in similar fields, women who wanted to network, who saw me as someone worth knowing professionally. Conference organizers invited me to speak at other events. Universities asked if I'd guest lecture in their business programs. The attention was strange, sometimes uncomfortable, often more than I wanted. But I accepted some invitations, declined others, tried to balance sharing what I'd learned with maintaining the privacy I valued. People from my past began surfacing, reaching out as my profile rose. Former colleagues from before my marriage, people who'd stopped inviting me to professional events after I became Mrs. Wellington, suddenly remembered we'd once worked together. Friends of Marcus who'd dropped me after the separation now sent messages saying they'd always known I was capable, that they'd never agreed with how the Wellington family treated me. The apologies arrived through email, through LinkedIn messages, sometimes through intermediaries. I'm sorry I didn't reach out during your divorce. I should have been more supportive. I'd love to reconnect now that things have settled. Each message was polite, usually sincere sounding, often containing some variation of wanting to catch up or hear how you're doing. I responded to each one with the same professional courtesy I'd have given to any business correspondence. Brief, polite, non-committal. Thank you for reaching out. I appreciate your kind words. I'm quite busy with current projects, but wish you well. No recriminations, no anger, no detailed explanations of why I wasn't interested in reconnecting with people who'd abandoned me when abandonment was the easy choice. Just polite distance. Some people pushed back wanting more, wanting explanation or absolution, or the chance to prove they'd changed their minds about me. I remained consistently cordial and consistently unavailable. Rebecca asked me about it once over coffee while we reviewed documents for the Jonathan Pierce case. You're not even a little bit tempted to tell them off, to point out that they only want to reconnect now that you've won. I thought about the satisfaction that might come from calling out their fair-weather loyalty, their opportunistic friendship. No, I said finally, because engaging with them, even to tell them off, means giving them emotional real estate they don't deserve. I've moved forward. They want to pull me backward into relitigating why they made the choices they made. I'm not interested. Respect doesn't arrive late, Rebecca said, quoting something I'd told her weeks earlier. Exactly. It arrives on time or not at all. The people who offered respect when it mattered, when I was in the middle of the divorce, when the outcome was uncertain, when being associated with me wasn't advantageous, those are the relationships I value. The people who are showing up now that I've won don't get the same access. A former colleague named David Brenner was particularly persistent. He'd been someone I'd considered a friend before my marriage, someone who'd stopped inviting me to industry events after I became Mrs. Wellington. Now he wanted to meet for lunch to hear about everything that had happened, to reconnect after too long. After his third email, I responded with more detail than I'd given the others. David, I appreciate your interest in reconnecting, but I need you to understand that friendships like respect have timing. When I needed professional connections and support, you weren't available. Now that my circumstances have changed, you're interested again. I'm sure you mean well, but I've built a different network now, one based on people who didn't require me to be successful before they valued me. I wish you all the best in your career. He didn't write back. I didn't expect him to. The message wasn't designed to hurt him, but to be clear, some doors once closed stay closed. Victoria, who'd become something closer to a friend than an ally during our months of working together, asked if I ever felt bitter about the people who'd dismissed me. Bitter. I considered the word, testing it against my actual feelings. No. Bitter requires me to care what they think, to want something from them I'm not getting. I don't want their apologies or their friendship. I've moved on to people and priorities that matter more. Bitterness would mean I'm still emotionally invested in their opinion of me. You're very zen about it, Victoria said with a slight smile. I'm practical about it. Bitterness would take energy I'd rather spend on building what comes next, instead of relitigating what already happened. 6 months after that first conference speech, my calendar had speaking invitations booked 4 months out. Universities wanted me for semester-long courses. Women's organizations invited me to keynote their annual events. Corporate HR departments asked about workshops on financial literacy for their female employees. I accepted maybe 20% of what I was offered, choosing opportunities that felt meaningful, that reached women who needed these tools, that aligned with the message I actually wanted to send. The publicity was strange, sometimes overwhelming, often more than I'd wanted when I started this journey 2 years ago. But the impact felt worthwhile. Women wrote to me about prenuptial agreements they'd negotiated after hearing my speech, about separate bank accounts they'd opened, about financial documents they'd reviewed with their own lawyers for the first time, about conversations they'd had with daughters about the importance of financial independence regardless of marital status. Those messages mattered more than the speaking fees or the LinkedIn followers or the professional recognition. She didn't need their apologies, she had already moved on. The phone call came on a Wednesday afternoon in October, 10 months after the divorce had finalized, 7 months after I'd filed the criminal referral against Jonathan Pierce. I was working in my apartment reviewing speaking notes for an upcoming conference when an unfamiliar number appeared on my phone. I almost didn't answer. but something made me pick up perhaps curiosity about who'd managed to get a number I'd only given to a handful of people. "Olivia." Marcus's voice recognizable even though I hadn't heard it in months. "Thank you for answering." I said nothing, waiting. "I need to talk to you about a proposal that could benefit both of us. Not an apology, not remorse. A proposal. Marcus Wellington approaching our post-divorce relationship the same way he'd approached our marriage, as a transaction to be negotiated." "I'm listening," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "My situation has become complicated. The trust fund restrictions are affecting my ability to maintain certain professional relationships. I've been advised that having your support could help me petition for early access to those funds. And in exchange, I'm willing to provide testimony in your case against Jonathan Pierce. I have information about his business dealings communications that could strengthen your case. I can be a valuable witness." I leaned back in my chair, looking out my apartment window at the city below, and thought about the audacity of this call. Marcus had spent our entire marriage using me for his purposes. Now, facing consequences for the first time in his life, he was trying to use me again. "Is that the complete proposal?" I asked. I think we both recognize that cooperation makes more sense than continued antagonism. We could help each other. It doesn't have to be personal. I let 5 seconds of silence stretch between us, long enough for Marcus to shift uncomfortably, to wonder if I was considering his offer, to perhaps hope that he'd found leverage after all. "I don't need your help, Marcus," I said finally. "The case against Jonathan is strong without your testimony, and you have nothing left to negotiate with. The trust fund clause was designed specifically to prevent what you're trying to do right now. There's no early access, no exceptions, no way for me to help you, even if I wanted to. Olivia." "Goodbye, Marcus." I ended the call, checked the duration, 48 seconds. I sat looking at the phone for a moment, processing the interaction. No anger, no satisfaction, no triumph. Just a mild annoyance at the interruption to my afternoon, like receiving a sales call from someone who didn't understand I wasn't a potential customer. The phone rang again 7 minutes later. Same unknown number. I didn't answer. It rang again an hour after that. Still didn't answer. Marcus called 3 times that evening, each call going to voicemail. I didn't listen to the messages, simply deleted them without playing them back. The next morning, an email appeared in my inbox. Marcus had somehow obtained my professional email address, probably through someone we'd both known during the marriage. The message was longer than the phone call, more detailed in its arguments about why cooperation would benefit both of us. I read the first paragraph, understood it was more of the same negotiation attempt, and blocked the sender address. 2 days later, Rebecca called. "I just heard from David Brenner. Marcus contacted him, asked him to pass along a message to you." David Brenner, the former colleague who'd wanted to reconnect after I'd become successful, who I'd politely declined to engage with. Apparently, he thought facilitating communication with my ex-husband would somehow earn him points. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "That you wouldn't be interested, but I wanted to check with you about how to handle this if others reach out." Standard response to anyone who contacts you. "Olivia Harper has requested that no messages from Marcus Wellington be forwarded to her. Thank you for understanding." Over the next week, 3 other people, mutual acquaintances from the marriage professional contacts who'd known both of us, reached out with variations of the same request. Marcus was trying to reach me through any channel he could find, apparently convinced that if he could just get through, if he could just make me listen to his full proposal, I'd see the logic of cooperating. I instructed each person with the same polite but firm message: please don't pass along communications from Marcus Wellington. Most accepted this without question. One, a woman named Patricia, who'd been in a book club with me during the marriage, pushed back slightly. "He seems genuinely desperate, Olivia. Maybe it would be kind to just hear him out." "I've heard his proposal," I said. "I'm not interested. Continuing to facilitate contact after I've declined would be unkind to both of us. It would give Marcus false hope and waste my time." Patricia didn't contact me again. I watched this play out with a detachment that surprised me. There was no satisfaction in Marcus's desperation, no pleasure in his inability to reach me. Just a recognition that he'd finally encountered a situation where his usual strategies didn't work. Marcus was accustomed to persistence paying off. In his world, if you called enough times, sent enough emails, used enough intermediaries, eventually people gave in simply to end the annoyance. What he couldn't understand was that I wasn't avoiding him out of anger or hurt. I was avoiding him because he was irrelevant to my life now. The realization seemed to reach him slowly. The contact attempts became less frequent, then stopped entirely. I imagine he finally understood I didn't hate him enough to respond. I simply didn't care anymore. Indifference is colder than hate. Hate requires emotional investment, requires caring enough about someone to want them to suffer or change or acknowledge what they've done. Indifference means they've become background noise, someone you don't think about when they're not actively trying to get your attention. Marcus had been erased from my life not through dramatic confrontation, but through simple disengagement. That understanding led me to examine what other connections remained from my old life, what threads still existed that could potentially be used to reach me or complicate my future. I spent a weekend in November conducting what I thought of as a systematic severance audit, a methodical review of every connection account document and relationship that linked me to the Wellington marriage. My phone number changed first. The number I'd had during the marriage, the one Marcus knew, the one old acquaintances might have saved, was disconnected. I set up a new number and distributed it only to people who needed it. Now, Rebecca, Victoria, professional contacts from my current work, close friends I'd made or reconnected with after the divorce. Legal documents were updated. Every filing that listed my married name was amended. Emergency contacts were changed. Beneficiary designations were reviewed and modified. I went through tax returns, insurance policies, medical records, ensuring nothing remained that identified me as Olivia Wellington. Social media accounts I'd barely used during the marriage were deleted entirely. I created new professional profiles with privacy settings that prevented anyone from my past from discovering them unless I chose to connect. Memberships in organizations I'd joined during the marriage country clubs, charity boards, social groups were formally resigned. I sent polite letters thanking them for the experience and noting that my circumstances had changed. The methodical approach was the same one I'd used to build my exit plan 2 years earlier. Not angry, not vindictive, just thorough. Every connection severed, every potential pathway closed, every loose end tied off. Rebecca watched me work through this process with a mixture of understanding and concern. "You're being very systematic about this," she observed during one of our meetings. "I learned from building the divorce plan," I said. "Halfway measures don't work. If you're going to extract yourself from a situation, you extract completely. Otherwise, you leave vulnerabilities that can be exploited later." "Are you worried Marcus will try to exploit something?" "No, Marcus is irrelevant now. But I don't want any remaining threads that connect me to that period of my life. I want a clean break. Complete freedom means complete severance." Within 3 months, the audit was finished. No one from the Wellington circle could reach me without going through formal channels. No old contacts had my new phone number or email address. My legal identity had been scrubbed of any reference to my married name. I'd moved to a different apartment in a different neighborhood. My professional networks were entirely new or refreshed from pre-marriage connections. Victoria, who'd undergone her own version of this 12 years earlier when she fled, understood completely. "It's not about running away," she said when I explained what I'd done. "It's about choosing who has access to you, who gets to be part of your life going forward." Exactly. The Wellington family used access as a form of control. They assumed that if they kept channels open, if your phone number stayed the same, if you remained in shared social circles, they could eventually pull you back in or at least make their presence felt. "I'm eliminating that assumption," I said. "You're taking ownership of your boundaries." The last piece of severance was the hardest, though it shouldn't have been. I'd kept one photograph from my wedding, a single image of my father who'd attended, despite being ill, looking proud and happy, even though he'd die less than a year later. The photograph included Marcus and me, but it was the only image I had of my father from that period. I took it to a professional photo restoration service and had them digitally remove everyone except my father. The technician did beautiful work. You'd never know the photo had been altered. Just my father smiling at what the viewer would assume was some formal event. I framed the altered photograph and put it on my desk. The original with Marcus and the Wellington family visible in the background I shredded. No sentimentality. No preservation of memories from a marriage that had been a means to an end. Just one photograph of the person who mattered, everyone else erased as thoroughly as I'd erased them from my life. Some doors close quietly and stay closed forever. I stood in my new office on a gray December morning exactly 2 years after the Christmas dinner that had changed everything. The space was smaller than I'd expected when I took over Harper & Associates, but it had windows that overlooked the city, and walls that held my father's photograph, the real one, not the altered version I kept at home, but an older image from when he'd first founded the company 25 years ago. Jonathan Pierce had been formally charged 3 weeks earlier. Federal prosecutors had built their case methodically, and the evidence I'd provided had formed the foundation. The charges included embezzlement, tax evasion, wire fraud, and most significantly, the case had been referred to state authorities for investigation into 2 suspicious deaths. My father's, Daniel Morrison's. The company had been returned to me through asset forfeiture proceedings taken from Jonathan before his trial as part of the evidence that the business itself had been acquired through criminal activity. The transition had been complicated, involved lawyers and accountants and months of paperwork, but it was done now. I was sitting in my father's old office. The company he'd built was mine again. I thought about Catherine Wellington's voice that Christmas night, sharp and cutting, saying the word that was meant to diminish me completely: useless. Now, 2 years later, I could see clearly what that word had actually meant. Catherine had lost her son not to death, but to consequences. Marcus was living in a modest apartment, working in a position far below what he'd been groomed for, trying to demonstrate the financial independence required to access his trust fund. The Wellington family's reputation had suffered. Catherine received sympathy from some quarters, judgment from others, but universally she was seen as a mother who'd pushed too hard and lost control of the situation she'd tried to manipulate. Elena Ross had lost the career she'd built, lost the future she'd imagined, and was working jobs that required none of the education or skills she'd spent years developing. She was 29 years old and starting over with a resume she couldn't use and references she couldn't call. Jonathan Pierce faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. His assets were frozen, his reputation destroyed, his carefully constructed facade of respectability demolished by evidence gathered over 2 years of patient investigation. Marcus had lost access to family wealth, lost his political future, lost the woman he'd planned to marry next, lost the respect of the circles he'd moved in. And I, the woman called useless, stood in an office with my name on the door. My father's company restored my reputation intact, my dignity preserved. But I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. The kind of tiredness that comes not from a single effort, but from 2 years of sustained focus, of carrying secrets, of playing roles, of never fully relaxing, because relaxation meant vulnerability. Victory wasn't sweet the way I'd imagined during all those months of planning. It wasn't satisfying in the visceral way revenge stories suggested it would be. It was just the end of something that had consumed too much time and energy. A long journey concluded. A burden set down. I'd learned something profound during those 2 years, something I wished I could share with every woman who'd ever felt powerless in her own life. You don't need to be loved to be respected. You don't need to explain yourself to have value. You don't need to fight loudly to win. Real strength doesn't come from defeating enemies. It comes from never giving anyone control over your life in the first place. From maintaining your own resources, your own knowledge, your own independence, even when you're sharing a life with someone. Preparation isn't lack of trust. It's self-respect. I thought about all the women I'd met since becoming public with my story. Women who'd given away financial control because their husbands handled the money. Women who'd signed documents they didn't read because their partners told them it was just paperwork. Women who'd lost access to their own bank accounts, their own credit, their own legal standing because they'd trusted that love would protect them. Love doesn't protect. Knowledge protects. Planning protects. Having your own resources protects. That's not a cynical worldview. It's a realistic one. You can hope for the best while preparing for the worst. You can love someone while maintaining your own autonomy. You can build a life together while keeping the capability to stand alone if necessary. Those aren't contradictions. They're the foundations of adult partnership. That's not pessimism. That's intelligence. I turned from the window and opened my laptop. I'd been corresponding with a nonprofit organization that supported women going through divorce, particularly women in situations where the power imbalance was severe. They'd asked if I'd be willing to share my experience in more detail, not for publicity, but for their training materials for the counselors who worked with women in crisis. I began drafting the email, choosing words carefully, trying to distill 2 years of experience into guidance that would actually help someone facing their own version of what I'd faced. This isn't a hero story, I wrote. I'm not braver than anyone else, not stronger, not more capable. What I was prepared. And preparation is something anyone can learn. I explained the importance of separate accounts of independent legal counsel, of maintaining professional networks that weren't tied to your spouse's connections. I described the value of documentation, of understanding all household finances, of knowing where important papers were kept. I wrote about the psychology of it, how preparation doesn't mean you're planning for failure. It means you're maintaining your adult autonomy, regardless of whether the relationship succeeds or fails. The email grew longer as I typed, became something more like a guide than a simple message. I worked on it for 2 hours, refining language, adding examples, trying to make complex financial and legal concepts accessible to women who might be reading this during the worst period of their lives. When I finished, I read it through once, then sent it. Life continues. No looking back. No regrets. Just moving forward. I wasn't the same woman who'd married Marcus Wellington 2 years ago. That woman had been strategic, yes, but also harder, more closed off, carrying grief she hadn't processed and anger she hadn't acknowledged. This woman, the one sitting in her father's office running his company, helping other women learn from her experience, was wiser, stronger, clearer about her own worth. The chapter was closed. A new one was beginning. And this time I was writing it entirely on my own terms. I looked at my father's photograph one more time and I could almost hear what he'd say if he were here. "You did good, Livy. You did real good." I didn't win by fighting. I won by never giving my power away. And that's a lesson every woman deserves to know. And that's Olivia's story. Not a fairy tale where love conquers all, but a real story about a woman who understood that protecting yourself isn't the same as giving up on trust. It's about honoring yourself enough to stay prepared, stay informed, and never hand over control of your own life, no matter how much you love someone. Catherine called her useless, but Olivia proved that quiet preparation is more powerful than loud control. That documentation matters more than drama. That self-respect doesn't need anyone's permission. If this story resonated with you, if you've learned something that might help you or someone you love, please subscribe to this channel and share this video. Leave a comment, telling me what surprised you most about Olivia's journey or what lesson you're taking away from her experience. Your engagement helps these stories reach more women who need to hear them. Remember, you can hope for the best while preparing for yourself. That's not cynicism. That's wisdom. Thank you for listening.